I stood in the center of the reception hall holding my husband's ashes in my trembling hands. His mother marched up to me, but instead of offering a warm embrace, she pulled a legal document from her designer purse. "Sign the house over right now, widow, or I will take everything you own," she whispered coldly. My heart shattered. But before I could even process her unbelievable cruelty, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the screen. A text message glowed in the dim light sent from my dead husband's phone. It read, "I am alive. I am Caroline. I am 62 years old, and for 30 years I spent every waking moment building a quiet, beautiful life with my husband, Richard. We owned a modest home in the suburbs, went to church every Sunday, and lived a simple American life. Richard ran a mid-sized logistics company, and I managed the accounting from our home office. We were happy. We were a team. Then 2 days ago, my entire world stopped spinning. Richard suffered a massive sudden heart attack right after his morning coffee. Just like that, the love of my life was gone. When the paramedics shook their heads, I felt my soul rip in half. In my deepest grief, I genuinely believed his family would be my support system. I thought we would mourn the man we loved together. I thought we would lean on each other to survive the devastating loss. I was completely and utterly wrong. The funeral reception was crowded with people wearing dark suits and offering hollow condolences. I stood near the back, clutching the heavy brass urn against my chest. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, approached me with her chin held high and her eyes as cold as stone. My brother-in-law, Greg, flanked her like a bodyguard. Neither of them offered me a tissue or a kind word. Instead, Beatrice snapped her expensive leather purse open and pulled out a freshly printed quitclaim deed. Richard owed Greg a massive amount of money from a business deal. Beatrice declared, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She shoved a pen toward my face. "Sign the deed to the house over to Greg right now, or we will drag you through probate court and sue you for every single penny you have left." I stared at her in pure shock. I was holding her son's ashes, and she was extorting me in front of the catering staff. Greg smirked and crossed his arms, waiting for me to cave. My hands shook violently. I felt dizzy, completely paralyzed by their sheer audacity and greed. Then a sharp buzz vibrated against my hip. I reached into my pocket, my fingers numb, and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up with a new text message. The sender was Richard. The message was brief, but it hit me harder than a freight train. "Do not sign a single thing. I am alive. Go to the bathroom right now, lock the door, and wait for my call." I stopped breathing. I looked at Beatrice, then at the glowing screen in my hand. The church reception hall smelled intensely of stale coffee and wilting white lilies. I stood near the back wall, holding the heavy brass urn against my chest. My knuckles were completely white from gripping it so tightly. It had only been a few days since Richard suffered that sudden massive heart attack right after his morning coffee. My mind was still trapped in that terrible nightmare. I kept seeing the paramedics shaking their heads in our kitchen. I kept seeing the flashing red lights illuminating our quiet suburban driveway. Now I was surrounded by a sea of dark suits and black dresses. People I had known for 30 years approached me with sad smiles, offering hollow condolences that faded into a dull buzz in my ears. I felt utterly hollow. I had built a beautiful, quiet life with Richard. We ran his mid-sized logistics company together from our home office. I did the accounting. He managed the clients. We were a flawless team. And now I was alone in a crowded room carrying the remains of my entire universe in a cold metal jar. I expected his family to be my anchor today. I genuinely believed that sharing this profound grief would bring us closer together. I looked up and saw my mother-in-law, Beatrice, walking toward me. She was flanked by my brother-in-law, Greg. Beatrice wore a pristine black designer suit that looked more appropriate for a high society gala than a memorial service. Her posture was rigid and her eyes were completely dry. There was no trace of a grieving mother on her face. Greg walked right beside her with his chest puffed out and a smug expression that made my stomach turn. I stepped forward slightly, preparing to offer Beatrice a comforting embrace. I thought she would reach out to hold me. I thought we would cry together over the man we both loved so deeply. I was entirely wrong. Beatrice did not open her arms. She did not offer a single word of comfort. Instead, she marched straight up to me and grabbed my elbow with fingers that felt like icy steel claws. She forcefully guided me away from the main crowd and pushed me backward into a secluded corner near the catering station. Greg followed close behind, blocking any chance of escape. We were standing so close to the serving tables that two young catering staff members froze with serving trays in their hands. They pretended not to look, but they were close enough to hear every single word. I looked at Beatrice in total confusion. I expected her to say something about the beautiful church service or how much she missed her eldest son. What came out of her mouth was pure venom. "You need to stop playing the tragic widow right now, Caroline," Beatrice hissed, her voice sharp and dripping with absolute disdain. "You have enjoyed a free ride on my son for 30 years, and that free ride ends today." I stared at her, completely paralyzed. I blinked rapidly, trying to process the sheer cruelty of her words. "A free ride?" I managed to whisper, my throat dry and aching. Beatrice sneered and looked me up and down, as if I were a piece of garbage she had found on her expensive shoes. "Do not act stupid with me," she snapped. "We all know you were just a trophy wife. You sat at home baking pies and spending Richard money while he broke his back, building that logistics company from the ground up. You contributed absolutely nothing to his success, and you certainly do not deserve to walk away with the fruits of his labor." Her words were a brutal slap to the face. A trophy wife. The accusation was so absurd, it took my breath away. When Richard and I first got married, we had absolutely nothing. He started with one used delivery truck, and I did the dispatching from our tiny kitchen table. I spent 3 decades doing the books, balancing the ledgers, managing the payroll, and making sure every single truck in his fleet stayed on the road. We worked side by side every single day. But Beatrice and Greg had never respected me. They always looked down on my working-class background. Beatrice had even refused to attend our wedding because it was not grand enough for her tastes. They hated that Richard chose a quiet, humble life with me instead of the flashy corporate lifestyle they always demanded. Greg crossed his arms and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Let us be real, Caroline. You were just a secretary he married out of pity, but the charity stops today." I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I hugged the heavy brass urn tighter against my chest, hoping to draw some strength from Richard. The cold metal pressed against my collarbone, grounding me in reality. I could not understand how they could be so vicious while the man they supposedly loved was resting in ashes between my hands. It felt like a desecration of his memory. Before I could even formulate a response to their vile insults, Beatrice snapped open her expensive leather purse. She reached inside and pulled out a stack of crisp legal documents. She shoved them directly into my chest, right against the urn. I looked down and saw the bold letters at the top of the page. It was a quitclaim deed for the house Richard and I had lived in for 25 years. "Sign it, widow." Beatrice ordered, her tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. I stared at the paper and then looked back at her perfectly powdered face. "Sign my house over?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of shock and sheer disbelief. Why on earth would I do that? Greg stepped closer, invading my personal space, until I could smell the overpowering cologne he always wore. He leaned down and pointed a thick finger directly at my face. "Because Richard died completely bankrupt." Greg stated loudly enough for the catering staff to visibly flinch and step back. His logistics company is entirely underwater. He was drowning in debt, and you were too busy playing housewife to even notice. He owed me a massive amount of money from a business deal gone wrong. Millions of dollars, Caroline. And your little suburban house is the only collateral left to cover his massive financial mess. I shook my head frantically. That was a lie, a blatant, horrific lie. I managed the corporate accounts. I knew exactly how much money the company made. We had zero debt. The business was highly profitable, and our home was completely paid off 10 years ago. There was absolutely no way Richard owed Greg a single dime. Greg was notoriously terrible with money. He was always launching failed startup companies, losing money in cryptocurrency schemes, and begging Richard for massive bailouts. Richard had finally cut his brother off financially a year ago after Greg asked for another ridiculous loan to fund a doomed restaurant venture. "You are lying," I whispered, finding a small fraction of my voice. "The company is completely fine. The house is paid for. Richard did not owe you anything." Beatrice slammed her hand onto the catering table, rattling the silver forks and crystal water glasses. "Do not dare call my son a liar," she barked, her eyes flashing with pure rage. "We have the paperwork to prove every single debt. You are going to sign the deed to that house over to Greg right now. If you do not sign it today, we will drag you through probate court. We will hire the most aggressive corporate lawyers in the state, and we will sue you for every single penny you have left." Greg leaned in even closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "We will freeze your bank accounts, Caroline. We will tie up the estate in litigation for years until the legal fees eat up your retirement fund. We will force you onto the street with nothing but the clothes on your back. Sign the document right now, or I promise you I will utterly destroy whatever is left of your miserable life." I stood there backed against the wall, holding the urn. I felt entirely trapped. The psychological violence of the moment was suffocating. I had just buried my husband hours ago. My eyes were swollen from crying. My body was completely exhausted from consecutive nights without sleep. I was in the deepest, most vulnerable state of grief a human being can possibly experience. And my own in-laws were using that exact moment to execute a calculated, hostile takeover of my entire life. They wanted to break me while I was already down. They assumed I was just a weak, grieving older woman who would sign anything just to make the yelling stop. They assumed I would be too confused and terrified by their legal threats to fight back. But as I looked into Beatrice's cold, calculating eyes and Greg's smug, arrogant face, the profound shock coursing through my veins began to shift. The paralyzing grief that had weighed me down all week suddenly cracked. A tiny ember of pure, unadulterated anger sparked deep inside my chest. They were not grieving. They were completely devoid of sorrow. They had marched into a funeral reception armed with legal documents and a rehearsed extortion plan. This was not a sudden emotional reaction born out of grief. This was a highly organized, premeditated ambush. They had been plotting to steal my home and my assets before Richard's body was even cold. Greg pulled a heavy silver pen from his suit jacket pocket and aggressively clicked it open. He shoved it toward my hand, pressing the metal barrel against my knuckles. "Do it now, Caroline. Sign the paper and we will leave you alone to mourn. We can do this the easy way, or we can ruin you today." Just as the pen touched my skin, a sharp vibration startled me. My phone buzzed violently in the pocket of my black skirt. It buzzed once, then twice. It was an insistent, urgent rhythm that broke the terrified trance I was in. I realized I needed a moment to breathe. I needed to get away from their suffocating, toxic presence before my legs gave out. I tightened my grip on the brass urn, refusing to take the pen from Greg's hand. "I am not signing anything right now," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady, despite the violent shaking of my shoulders. "I need to use the restroom." Beatrice stepped sideways, blocking my path. Her eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "You are not going anywhere until this deed is signed." I looked at her with a sudden fierce determination that surprised both of us. "Get out of my way, Beatrice," I warned, stepping forward with the heavy brass urn raised slightly, as if it were a shield. "I am going to the bathroom. You can wait." Before she could reach out and grab my arm again, I pushed past her and walked swiftly toward the main hallway. I could hear Greg cursing under his breath behind me, but I did not look back. I practically ran down the long corridor, my heart hammering against my ribs. I clutched the urn and my purse as if my survival depended on them. I pushed open the heavy wooden door of the ladies' room, went into the furthest stall, and locked the door behind me. I leaned my back against the cold tile wall, gasping for air, trying to calm my racing pulse. My hands were shaking so terribly I could barely reach into my pocket. I pulled out my phone, completely unprepared for the message that was waiting to turn my nightmare into something entirely unimaginable. I locked the heavy wooden door of the church bathroom and leaned my entire body weight against it. My breathing was ragged and shallow. The air inside the small room smelled of cheap floral air freshener and industrial soap. I could barely register anything but the glowing screen of my phone. I stared at the text message until the letters blurred together. Do not sign a single thing. I am alive. Go to the bathroom right now, lock the door, and wait for my call. My heart pounded wildly against my ribs. It felt like a trapped bird desperately trying to escape. I looked down at the brass urn resting on the edge of the porcelain sink. The metal was cold under my fingertips. I had spent the last 3 days crying over this urn. I had slept beside it. I had spoken to it in the darkest hours of the night. How could Richard be alive? It was absolutely impossible. I had seen the paramedics working on him. I had watched them cover his face. A sudden, terrifying thought seized me. This was a sick, twisted game. Greg and Beatrice were tech-savvy enough to spoof a phone number. They were probably sitting in the reception hall right now laughing at my panic. They wanted to drive me insane so they could easily take the house. My thumb hovered over the screen, ready to delete the message and turn the phone off completely. But then the phone began to vibrate in my palm. The caller ID displayed a scrambled string of numbers. It was a blocked international routing code. My hands shook so violently that I almost dropped the phone onto the hard tile floor. I took a deep, trembling breath and pressed the green button. I brought the phone to my ear, but I did not say a word. I simply listened to the faint static on the line. Caroline. The voice was low and gravelly. It was a voice I had listened to every single day for 30 years. It was the voice that had promised to love me forever on our wedding day. It was the voice that had whispered comforting words to me during the hardest moments of our lives. It was Richard. I pressed my hand hard over my mouth to stifle a scream. My knees gave out entirely. I slid down the cold bathroom door until I hit the floor. The tile chilled my legs, but the shock freezing my veins was infinitely colder. "Who is this?" I demanded. My voice was nothing but a harsh, frantic whisper. "If this is a joke, Greg, I swear to God I will call the police right now." Caroline listened to me very carefully. The voice on the other end replied with that familiar, calm authority. "It is not a joke. It is me. Do you remember our 10th anniversary? We drove up the coast to that terrible little motel in Maine because the engine in my old truck blew a gasket. We ate cold canned beans on the hood of the truck, and you said it was the best meal of your life." A fresh wave of tears cascaded down my cheeks. No one knew that story. We had never told a single living soul about that disastrous anniversary. Beatrice thought we had stayed at a luxury resort. Greg thought we had flown to an island. Only Richard and I knew the truth about the cold beans and the broken engine. "Richard," I choked out, unable to hold back the violent sobs tearing through my throat. "Richard, how is this possible? I watched them take you away. I planned your funeral. I am holding your ashes right now." The voice on the line softened, filled with profound sorrow and regret. "I know, my love. I know what they have put you through, and I am so incredibly sorry. The ashes in that urn are completely fake. It is nothing but fireplace ash and sand. Put the urn down, Caroline. You do not need to carry it anymore." I stared at the brass urn on the sink. My hands were shaking so much I had to put them flat on the floor to steady myself. I felt like I was losing my mind. The grief, the confusion, and the sheer relief were crashing together in a chaotic storm inside my head. "What is happening, Richard?" I pleaded. "Why did you fake your death? Why are your mother and brother threatening to take our home? They say you owe them millions. They say your company is bankrupt. They are lying, Caroline." Richard said, his voice suddenly growing hard and resolute. "The company is completely fine. I am not bankrupt, but we are in grave danger. You need to listen to me, and you need to stay absolutely calm. My mother and Greg did not just show up to extort you today. 3 days ago, they tried to murder me." The words hit me like a physical blow. Murder. My mind raced back to that horrible morning. Richard had been drinking his coffee. He had complained of a strange, bitter taste. 10 minutes later, he was clutching his chest, collapsing onto the kitchen floor. The doctors at the hospital had pronounced him dead from a massive coronary event. "They swapped my daily heart medication, Caroline," Richard explained, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "Greg managed to get into my briefcase during our family dinner last Sunday. He replaced my prescription pills with a lethal, untraceable stimulant. It was designed to trigger a massive fatal cardiac arrest. They wanted it to look exactly like a natural heart attack." I gasped for air. The room started to spin. His own mother, his own brother. They had sat at our dining table eating the roast I had prepared, smiling at us while they planted a death sentence in his briefcase. "But how did you survive?" I whispered. "I realized something was wrong the moment the chest pains hit," Richard said. The pain was entirely different from my usual angina. It felt chemical, artificial. When the paramedics arrived, I managed to whisper the name of the medication to one of them. By the absolute grace of God, the lead paramedic was a former military medic. He recognized the symptoms of a stimulant overdose and administered a counteracting agent in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. My heart stopped twice, Caroline, but they brought me back. I closed my eyes, picturing the chaotic scene inside the ambulance. The man I loved fighting for his life against a poison planted by his own flesh and blood. When I woke up in the intensive care unit, I knew exactly who was responsible. Richard continued. "I knew Greg was desperate. A few weeks ago, I discovered massive discrepancies in the corporate accounts. Greg had been quietly embezzling millions of dollars from the logistics company for the past 2 years. He was funneling the money into offshore accounts to cover his massive gambling debts and failed investments. My mother knew everything. She was helping him cover his tracks by manipulating the quarterly tax reports. The pieces of the puzzle began to violently snap together in my mind. Beatrice and Greg had always been thick as thieves. They always whispered in corners during family gatherings. Beatrice had always enabled Greg in his reckless financial behavior, treating him like a golden child who could do no wrong. "I confronted Greg about the missing money last week," Richard said. "I told him I was bringing in forensic auditors and turning the evidence over to the authorities. I gave him a chance to come clean. Instead, he and my mother decided the easiest way to silence me and take total control of the company was to put me in the ground. My blood ran completely cold. They tried to murder my husband over money. And now they were sitting just a few yards away eating catered food and mingling with our friends as if they were innocent, grieving relatives. The sheer monstrous audacity of it made me physically sick. If you survived, why did they tell me you died? I asked, my voice trembling with a new rising fury. Why did you let me believe I had lost you forever? Because the FBI intervened, Caroline? Richard explained, his voice full of urgency. When the hospital toxicology report confirmed the presence of the illegal stimulant, the federal authorities were immediately notified. 2 agents visited me in my hospital room. I told them everything about the embezzlement and the murder attempt. But the agents told me that proving attempted murder with a switched pill would be incredibly difficult in court. Greg is slippery. He would claim I accidentally took the wrong medication. They needed solid, irrefutable proof of their entire criminal enterprise. I wiped my tears away with the back of my hand. My fear was rapidly transforming into an intense, burning focus. What kind of proof did they need? They needed Greg and my mother to believe their plan had worked perfectly, Richard said. The agents explained that if I was officially pronounced dead, Greg would immediately move to take over the company assets. He would have to access his hidden offshore accounts to transfer the embezzled funds. He would leave a massive glowing paper trail of his financial crimes and extortion tactics. The FBI needed them to incriminate themselves fully. So we faked the death certificate. The federal agents placed me in a secure, undisclosed location while they monitor every single financial move Greg and my mother make. I let out a shaky breath. You let me suffer, Richard. You let me plan a funeral. I have not slept in 3 days. I know Caroline and I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Richard said, his voice breaking with emotion. But the feds insisted. They said if you knew the truth, you would not be able to fake the grief. Greg and my mother are incredibly observant. If they saw even a hint of relief in your eyes, they would know something was wrong, and they would destroy the evidence and flee the country. Your genuine grief was the only thing that sold the illusion. You saved my life, Caroline. You protected the investigation by simply being you. I pressed the palm of my hand against my forehead. The logic was brutal, but flawless. Beatrice had scrutinized my every move today, looking for weakness. If I had known Richard was alive, I would have never been able to produce the shattered, heartbroken performance that had convinced them their evil plan was a complete success. What do I do now? I asked, my voice hardening with resolve. They cornered me by the food station. They demanded I sign the quitclaim deed to the house. They threatened to drag me through probate court and freeze my bank accounts if I refuse. Do not sign a single document, Richard ordered. They have absolutely no legal authority. The company is safe and our home is completely secure, but you cannot let them know that you know. You have to go back out there and play the role of the terrified, helpless widow. You must let them believe they hold all the cards. I stood up slowly, leaning against the bathroom stall. My legs felt stronger now. The crushing weight of the grief had evaporated, replaced by a fierce protective adrenaline. I can do that, I said. What is the next step? Richard paused, and I could hear the deep seriousness in his tone. This is the most important part, Caroline. Listen carefully. Greg and my mother are going to insist on coming home with you tonight. They are going to claim they want to comfort you, but that is a lie. They are planning to move into the house so they can search my home office, search for what I asked. There is a blue leather ledger, Richard explained. I kept a manual record of every single fraudulent transaction Greg made. I printed out the routing numbers for his offshore accounts and the falsified tax documents my mother created. I hid the ledger in the study because I knew they would try to scrub the digital servers at the corporate office. If Greg finds that blue ledger tonight, he will burn it. If he destroys that physical evidence, the FBI will have a much harder time securing a conviction for the massive corporate fraud. Where is the ledger, Richard? I asked, my eyes darting toward the bathroom door, making sure no one was trying to enter. Go into my study, Richard instructed. Go to the large oak bookshelf on the far wall. Take out the encyclopedia volumes on the bottom shelf. There is a loose wooden floorboard directly underneath those books. Pry it up. The blue ledger is inside, along with a key to a safety deposit box at the downtown bank. You have to get that ledger out of the house before they find it. I repeated the instructions in my head. The oak bookshelf, the bottom shelf, the loose floorboard. I understood perfectly. Caroline, they are going to push you to the breaking point tonight, Richard warned, his voice filled with protective anxiety. They are going to be cruel. They are going to try to break your spirit and make you question your own sanity. You have to let them do it. You have to swallow your pride and let them invade our home. Can you do this, my love? Can you face them? I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. My face was pale. My eyes were red and swollen. I looked exactly like a broken, defeated older woman who had lost everything, but behind my eyes a new fire was burning brightly. I was no longer a grieving widow. I was a woman preparing for war. I can do this, Richard, I said firmly. I will find the ledger. I will secure the evidence. I love you, Caroline, Richard said. The FBI is monitoring their phones. When the time is right, we will strike. Just survive tonight. The line went dead. I lowered the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I looked at the brass urn sitting on the sink. Knowing it was filled with nothing but worthless sand and ash brought a bizarre, twisted smile to my face. I reached over and grabbed a paper towel, wetting it with cold water to dab my flushed cheeks. I needed to look devastated. I needed to look terrified. I picked up the urn, cradling it against my chest with the exact same desperate grip I had used before. I took one last deep breath, channeling every ounce of sorrow I had felt over the last 3 days. I unlocked the bathroom stall and walked toward the heavy wooden door. It was time to go back out there. It was time to face the people who had tried to murder my husband. It was time to walk straight into the lion den with a grieving smile on my face and let the monsters believe they had completely won. The heavy wooden door of the church bathroom felt like a solid barrier between two entirely different realities. On one side of that door, I had been a shattered, grieving woman whose life had been utterly destroyed. On the other side, I was now a woman armed with the most dangerous truth imaginable. My husband was alive. The ashes I held in my hands were nothing but meaningless dust, and the people waiting for me in the reception hall were cold-blooded attempted murderers. I took a deep breath, forcing my lungs to expand against the tight panic gripping my chest. I let my shoulders slump forward and allowed my eyes to drop, focusing on the patterned carpet. I needed to be the perfect picture of a broken, defenseless widow. I pushed the door open and walked back out into the sea of black suits and solemn faces. Beatrice and Greg were waiting near the exit, exactly where I had left them. Their eyes locked onto me instantly, tracking my slow, shuffling steps like predators watching a wounded bird. Beside them stood Greg's wife Brenda, a woman who always wore far too much cloying floral perfume and looked at my life with poorly concealed jealousy. Today, however, her jealousy had completely transformed into a radiant, predatory smugness. She did not offer me a sympathetic smile or a warm embrace. She simply crossed her arms and stared at me with an entitled smirk. "We are taking you home, Caroline," Beatrice announced. Her tone left absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. "You are clearly in a state of severe shock. You cannot possibly be expected to be alone in that big, empty house tonight. We will stay with you to provide comfort and handle the necessary arrangements." I kept my head bowed and nodded weakly, giving them the exact submission they craved. I allowed Greg to place a heavy guiding hand on my shoulder, steering me out of the church and toward his luxury sedan. The ride back to my house was suffocating. The silence in the car was thick and oppressive, broken only by Brenda humming a cheerful pop song on the radio. No one spoke of Richard. No one shared a fond memory of the man we had just supposedly laid to rest. They simply exchanged knowing glances in the rearview mirror, communicating a shared victory that made my stomach churn with disgust. I clutched the heavy brass urn on my lap, staring blankly out the window, channeling every ounce of my energy into keeping my breathing steady and my face completely passive. We finally pulled into my driveway. The house Richard and I had meticulously built together stood quiet and dark against the fading evening sky. It was my sanctuary, the place where we had shared 30 years of laughter, quiet mornings, and profound love. Before I could even pull my house key from my purse, Greg reached over and snatched it right out of my trembling fingers. "Let me handle this, Caroline," he declared, his voice booming with unearned authority. "You are entirely too fragile to manage anything right now." He marched up the front steps, pushed the heavy oak door open, and strode inside as if his name were the only one on the property deed. Beatrice and Brenda followed right behind him, stepping over the threshold without wiping their shoes, tracking dirt onto the pristine foyer rug. I stepped inside last, closing the door quietly behind me. The very second the lock clicked shut, the entire atmosphere in the house violently shifted. The thin, flimsy veil of familial mourning evaporated into thin air. The pretense of comforting the grieving widow was instantly discarded. Greg walked straight into the living room and tossed his suit jacket carelessly onto my pristine white sofa. He bypassed the seating area entirely and marched directly toward Richard's antique mahogany liquor cabinet. Richard had spent years collecting rare vintage scotches from his business travels around the world. He only ever opened those bottles for special occasions or to toast a major victory at the logistics company. Greg did not hesitate. He grabbed the most expensive bottle of scotch on the top shelf, broke the wax seal, and poured a massive amount of the amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. "Caroline, go to the kitchen and fetch us some ice," Greg commanded without even bothering to look at me. "And bring 3 more glasses." My mother and Brenda need a drink after dealing with that miserable, depressing reception all afternoon. My hands tightened around the brass urn. The sheer disrespect was staggering. He was treating me like a hired maid in my own home hours after my husband's funeral. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash the urn over his arrogant head and throw them all out into the street. But I remembered Richard's urgent voice on the phone. "They are going to push you to the breaking point tonight. You must let them believe they hold all the cards." I swallowed the burning rage rising in my throat. I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes cast downward, and shuffled quietly toward the kitchen. I set the urn carefully on the granite kitchen counter, leaning against the sink for a fleeting moment to gather my strength. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes and visualizing the blue ledger hidden under the floorboards in the study. That ledger was the only thing that mattered tonight. I opened the freezer, pulled out the ice bucket, and arranged 3 crystal glasses on a silver serving tray. I walked back into the living room, balancing the heavy tray, playing my assigned role to absolute perfection. When I returned, Beatrice was already seated comfortably in Richard's favorite leather recliner. It was the chair he sat in every evening to read the paper, and she was sitting in it with her shoes propped up on the matching ottoman. Brenda was standing near the fireplace, casually inspecting a valuable silver clock Richard had received as an award. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands with a greedy gleam in her eyes before setting it back down completely out of place. "Thank you, Caroline," Beatrice said, taking a glass from the tray without offering a single glance of gratitude. "Now be a dear and go make us some coffee. And see if you have any decent food in that kitchen. We are absolutely famished." I silently nodded and retreated back to the kitchen. While I brewed the coffee, I listened to their voices echoing down the hallway. They were not speaking in hushed, respectful tones. They were talking loudly and cheerfully. I heard the clinking of glasses and Greg's booming laughter. It was a victory celebration. They were toasting to their successful murder and their impending wealth right in the middle of my living room. I gripped the edge of the counter so hard, my fingernails dug painfully into my palms. I poured the coffee into 3 mugs, placed them on a new tray, and carried them out to my hostile invaders. As I walked into the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. Brenda was emerging from the hallway that led to the bedrooms, carrying a stack of flattened cardboard moving boxes. She dropped them onto the living room rug with a loud thud. She already had a thick roll of packing tape slung around her wrist. "What are those for?" I asked, my voice trembling with a carefully manufactured mixture of confusion and fear. Greg took a long, slow sip of his expensive scotch and smiled a cold, predatory smile. "We are just getting a head start, Caroline," he said casually, waving his hand toward the hallway. Richard had a lot of very expensive things that belonged to the family estate. "We are simply taking inventory and securing the valuable assets before anything accidentally goes missing." My heart hammered against my ribs. I watched in absolute horror as Brenda walked straight past me and headed directly into Richard's private study. The study. The exact room where the blue ledger was hidden. Panic flared hot and bright in my chest, but I forced myself to remain rooted to the spot. If I rushed into the study to stop her, I would instantly give away the fact that there was something incredibly valuable hidden inside. I had to let her rummage. I had to trust that Richard had hidden the floorboard well enough to escape a casual sweep. A few minutes later, Brenda emerged from the study carrying a large velvet display box. She brought it into the living room and popped the lid open. Inside rested Richard's collection of luxury watches. He had earned every single one of those watches through years of grueling hard work and sleepless nights building his business. Greg walked over, pulled out a heavy gold Rolex, and strapped it right onto his own wrist, holding his arm up to admire the fit. He always said this one was too flashy for him, Greg muttered, admiring the gold in the light. It looks much better on me anyway. He owed me this much, at least. He owed you, I whispered, playing the role of the bewildered, grieving widow perfectly. He did not owe you anything, Greg. These are his personal belongings. Please, you cannot just take his things. He just died today. Beatrice slammed her coffee mug onto the glass coffee table, causing the dark liquid to slosh violently over the rim. Do not use that pathetic whining tone with us, Caroline. She snapped, her eyes narrowing with vicious contempt. You heard Greg at the church. Richard died bankrupt. He left behind a massive mountain of debt that is going to fall directly onto this family. We are taking his luxury items to liquidate them and cover the incredible financial mess he created. You should be thanking us on your hands and knees for cleaning up his disaster instead of crying over a few shiny watches. I looked at the floor, biting the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted a sharp tang of copper blood. The restraint it took to not scream the truth in their faces was agonizing. I nodded slowly, wrapping my arms around my own torso to make myself look small and entirely defeated. I understand, I murmured softly, letting my voice crack with feigned sorrow. I am just so overwhelmed. Everything is happening so fast. Brenda let out a short, dismissive laugh as she started taping a cardboard box together. You will get over it, Caroline, she said maliciously. It is just stuff. You cannot take it with you anyway. She immediately walked past me again, this time heading straight into the master bedroom. I could hear her opening the heavy wooden doors of Richard's closet, dragging wooden hangers across the metal rod. She was literally boxing up his tailored suits and expensive shoes while I stood powerless in the hallway. The psychological torture of watching them tear apart my home piece by piece was nearly unbearable. They were erasing Richard from the house, systematically stripping away his dignity and his presence. They were claiming absolute dominance over my space, proving that they had total control over my life and my future. I walked slowly back into the living room, standing near the edge of the sofa, like a frightened ghost haunting my own home. Greg poured himself a second massive glass of scotch and walked over to me. He stood uncomfortably close, forcing me to look up into his smug, triumphant eyes. Listen to me very carefully, Caroline, he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. You are going to sign that quitclaim deed first thing tomorrow morning. I already have my corporate lawyer preparing the final transfer paperwork. You are going to hand over the house, the cars, and all of Richard's remaining financial accounts without a single word of protest. I looked down at his polished leather shoes, shrinking away from his aggressive posture. And what if I do not sign? I whispered, maintaining the facade of a terrified, broken woman. Where am I supposed to go, Greg? This is my home. I have lived here for 25 years. Greg chuckled, a dark, humorless sound that echoed off the high ceilings. You do not have a home anymore, Caroline. This house is company collateral. And since I am stepping in to take over the company to save it from total ruin, this house officially belongs to me. If you cooperate, we might be generous enough to let you rent a cheap little apartment across town. If you fight us, we will throw you out into the street tomorrow afternoon with absolutely nothing. The choice is entirely yours. Beatrice nodded in agreement, swirling the last drops of coffee in her mug. You are a very lucky woman, Caroline. We are being incredibly gracious considering the circumstances. You were never truly part of this family. We tolerated you because Richard insisted. But now that he is gone, the charity has officially expired. I kept my head bowed, letting a single tear slip down my cheek for dramatic effect. I needed them to see me break. I needed them to feel completely victorious, so they would let their guard down. You are right, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of Brenda dragging a heavy cardboard box out of my bedroom. I am just so tired. I cannot fight you. I will do whatever you want. I will do. Greg smiled, a wide, terrifying display of pure, greedy satisfaction. He patted my shoulder with a heavy, patronizing hand. Good girl. I knew you would finally see reason. It is much better to just surrender to the inevitable. He turned away from me and looked toward the hallway where Brenda was emerging with another box of Richard belongings. Oh, and one more thing, Caroline, Greg added casually, as if he were discussing the weather. Brenda and I are going to be staying here indefinitely while the estate goes through probate. It will be much easier for us to manage the transition from here. I froze, feeling a fresh spike of genuine panic. Staying here, I repeated. Yes, Greg confirmed, waving his hand dismissively toward the hallway. And since you clearly will not be needing all that empty space anymore, Brenda and I will be taking over the master bedroom starting tonight. You can move your things into the small guest room down the hall. It is more than enough space for a widow. The sheer disrespect of the demand was monumental. They were kicking me out of the bed I had shared with my husband for 25 years on the very night of his funeral. They were claiming the ultimate territory, asserting their absolute dominance over my sanctuary. I looked at Greg and then at Beatrice, who was watching me with a cold, satisfied smirk. I wanted to unleash a tidal wave of fury upon them. But the image of the blue ledger hidden under the floorboards in the study burned brightly in my mind. The master bedroom was on the opposite side of the house from the study. If they slept in my room tonight, I would have a clear, undetected path to the hidden floorboard. Their arrogance was actually giving me the exact tactical advantage I needed. I swallowed hard, forcing a look of devastated submission onto my face. Okay, Greg, I whispered softly, stepping back from him. I will gather some clothes and move to the guest room right now. I turned and walked slowly down the hallway, feeling their victorious, mocking gazes burning into my back. I kept my shoulders slumped and my head down, playing the role of the defeated, shattered widow. But as soon as I turned the corner out of their sight, my tears vanished instantly. My spine straightened. My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. I had successfully surrendered the battle to secure the war. They had taken my husband watches. They had stolen my bedroom. They had invaded my sacred home. But they had completely underestimated me. I was going to find that blue ledger tonight, and I was going to burn their entire criminal empire to the ground. Let them drink the expensive scotch. Let them sleep in my bed. Their reign of terror was about to come to a spectacular, devastating end. I walked into the dark guest room and closed the door, preparing to wait for the quiet hours of the night. The invasion was complete, but my retribution was just beginning. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 times. The low, heavy sound vibrated through the thin walls of the cramped guest room. I lay perfectly still on the narrow mattress, staring up at the dark ceiling. My muscles ached from the tension. Down the hall in the master bedroom that rightfully belonged to me, I could hear the muffled snores of my brother-in-law Greg. His wife Brenda was in there with him, sleeping comfortably in the bed I had shared with my husband for 25 years. It made my blood boil, but I channeled that anger into a sharp, intense focus. Richard was alive. He was counting on me. I threw off the thin cotton blanket and swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My bare feet touched the cold hardwood floor. I did not bother putting on my slippers because the rubber soles would squeak. I tiptoed toward the door, turning the brass knob with excruciating slowness to prevent the internal mechanism from clicking. The hallway was completely black. I knew this house blindly. I knew exactly which floorboards groaned and which ones were silent. I bypassed the creaky spot near the linen closet and glided like a ghost toward Richard's home office at the far end of the corridor. The study door was slightly ajar. I slipped inside and gently pushed it closed behind me. The familiar scent of leather-bound books and Richard's favorite cedar aftershave washed over me. For a fleeting second, I wanted to collapse onto the floor and weep, but I forced my spine to remain straight. Moonlight filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, casting long gray shadows across the room. I looked toward the far wall. There it was. The massive oak bookshelf Richard had built with his own 2 hands. I took a quiet step forward, then another. I was just 5 feet away from the bottom shelf where the heavy encyclopedias sat. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Suddenly, the bright overhead chandelier snapped on, blinding me. I gasped, shielding my eyes with my hands. Standing by the light switch near the door was Greg. He was wearing silk pajamas and holding a half-empty glass of water. His face was twisted into a malicious, suspicious sneer. "Looking for something, Caroline?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. My mind raced. I could not let him know what I was actually doing. I dropped my hands and forced a look of bewildered sorrow onto my face. I could not sleep, I whispered, wrapping my arms around my chest. I was looking for the old photo album, the one with the pictures from our trip to the mountains. I just wanted to feel close to him, Greg. Greg let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He set his water glass down on Richard's mahogany desk and walked slowly toward me. He looked at me as if I were a pathetic stray animal. "You are wandering the house in the pitch-black dark looking for a photo album at 2 a.m. He shook his head and clicked his tongue. "This is exactly what Beatrice was worried about. You are losing your grip on reality, Caroline. Your mind is completely cracking under the pressure." He grabbed my upper arm. His grip was entirely too tight. His thick fingers dug painfully into my skin. "Come on," he ordered, practically dragging me out of the study. "You are going back to bed, and you are going to stay there until morning. If you keep wandering around like a ghost, we are going to have a serious problem." He shoved me back into the guest room and pulled the door shut. I stood in the dark, rubbing my bruised arm. He had caught me. I did not get the ledger, and worse, I had given them the perfect ammunition for their next attack. The psychological warfare began the very next morning. I walked into my own kitchen to find it completely trashed. Empty wine bottles cluttered the countertops. Dirty plates were piled high in the sink. Beatrice was sitting at the breakfast nook, sipping coffee, while Brenda flipped through a fashion magazine. Neither of them offered me a greeting. I walked over to the counter where I always left my reading glasses. They were gone. I searched the counter, the kitchen island, and the small table by the door. I knew exactly where I had placed them the night before. I always put them next to the fruit bowl. "Have either of you seen my glasses?" I asked, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. Brenda did not even look up from her magazine. She simply sighed a loud, exaggerated sigh. "Check the refrigerator, Caroline," she said casually. I frowned. The refrigerator. I opened the stainless steel door. Sitting right next to a carton of milk shivering in the cold air were my reading glasses. I stared at them in absolute shock. I reached out and picked them up. The lenses were frosted over. Why were my glasses in the refrigerator? I demanded, turning to face them. Beatrice lowered her coffee mug and looked at me with an expression of deep theatrical pity. "That is exactly what we would like to know, dear," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Brenda found them in there when she went to get the milk this morning. You must have put them there when you were wandering around the house in a daze last night. Greg told us about your little sleepwalking episode." "I did not put my glasses in the refrigerator," I said firmly. "Brenda, you moved them. You put them in there to mess with me." Brenda gasped, pressing a hand to her chest in mock horror. "I would never do such a thing, Caroline. You are completely paranoid. You need to accept that your memory is failing. Grief does terrible things to the elderly brain." I clenched my jaw. They were gaslighting me. They were deliberately orchestrating situations to make me feel insane. It was a classic, calculated abuse tactic. But I knew the truth. I knew Richard was alive. I knew I had to stay sharp. I put my glasses in my pocket and turned away, refusing to give them the hysterical reaction they so desperately wanted. But they did not stop there. The campaign of psychological torture escalated rapidly over the next 2 days. My car keys vanished from the hook by the door. I spent an hour frantically searching the house only to have Greg pull them out of the bathroom trash can with a smug look of fake concern. They constantly moved my purse, hiding it under the sofa cushions or inside the hall closet. Every single time I questioned them, they would exchange sorrowful glances and tell me I was losing my mind. They spoke to me slowly and loudly as if I were a confused toddler. The absolute lowest point came on Thursday afternoon. I was sitting in the living room trying to read a book and ignore the loud television program Greg had put on. The doorbell rang. Beatrice rushed to answer it. It was Mrs. Higgins, my kind elderly neighbor from across the street. She had brought a warm casserole wrapped in tin foil to offer her condolences. I stood up and walked toward the foyer, ready to thank her for the lovely gesture, but Beatrice intercepted her right at the front door, physically blocking her from stepping inside. "Oh, Margaret, you are so sweet to bring this," Beatrice said, taking the casserole dish. Her voice was artificially loud, making sure I could hear every word from the hallway. "But I am afraid Caroline cannot receive visitors right now. It is just too tragic." Mrs. Higgins looked worried. "Is she all right, Beatrice?" I wanted to give her a hug. Beatrice leaned in close to the poor woman, lowering her voice to a dramatic theatrical whisper. "She is completely losing her mind, Margaret. We are absolutely terrified for her safety. She wanders the halls at 3 a.m, crying out for Richard. She claims she can hear his voice talking to her through the walls. She thinks he is still alive. We have to hide the kitchen knives at night because she is so unstable." I felt a surge of pure molten rage tear through my chest. I stepped out of the hallway directly into their line of sight. "I am perfectly fine, Mrs. Higgins," I said, forcing a wide, reassuring smile onto my face. "Beatrice is just exaggerating. Thank you so much for the casserole." Mrs. Higgins looked at me, but her eyes were wide with genuine fear. The poison Beatrice had poured into her ear had already taken root. I saw Mrs. Higgins glance at my wrinkled clothes and my tired, swollen eyes. To her, I probably did look like a woman descending into madness. "Oh, Caroline, you just go and rest," Mrs. Higgins stammered, taking a quick step backward toward her porch. "Let your family take care of you, dear. It is so sad, so very sad." She practically ran down the driveway. I stood at the door completely humiliated. Beatrice turned to me and smirked. A cold, victorious smile spread across her powdered face. "You see, Caroline," she whispered viciously, "everyone knows you are unstable. The whole neighborhood pities you. When the time comes to make the necessary medical decisions, no one will question us. They will all agree that you belong in a locked facility for your own protection." They were building a public case against me. They were creating a false narrative of severe mental decline so they could legally strip me of my rights and my property. The realization hit me like a bucket of freezing water. I did not have much time left. If I did not find the blue ledger soon, they would call a doctor and have me forcibly removed from my own home. I had to get into the study. I waited 2 agonizing days for the perfect opportunity. I endured their insults. I endured Brenda hiding my shoes and telling me I had thrown them away. I endured Greg drinking my husband expensive wine and laughing in my face. I played the part of the broken, confused widow to absolute perfection, giving them a false sense of total security. On Saturday afternoon, the moment finally arrived. Greg and Brenda had gone out to the backyard patio to drink mimosas in the sunshine. They were laughing loudly, clinking their glasses together. Beatrice had complained of a headache and gone upstairs to take a nap in the guest room. The main floor of the house was completely empty. This was my chance. I slipped out of the kitchen, moving with silent, desperate speed. I crossed the hallway and pressed my hand against the brass handle of the study door. I turned it slowly, pushing the heavy mahogany wood open. I stepped inside and shut the door quietly behind me, leaving it unlocked so it would not make a sound. The room was still and quiet. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight pouring through the window. I did not waste a single second. I rushed straight to the massive oak bookshelf on the far wall. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the sharp pain radiating through my joints. I grabbed the heavy leather-bound encyclopedias on the bottom shelf and pulled them out, tossing them haphazardly onto the Persian rug. I stared at the exposed wooden floorboards. At first glance, they looked perfectly seamless. But as I ran my trembling fingers along the grain, I felt a slight ridge, a tiny gap between the planks. I dug my fingernails into the crack and pulled upward with all my strength. The short piece of oak popped out smoothly, revealing a dark rectangular cavity hidden between the floor joists. My breath caught in my throat. I reached my hand down into the dusty darkness. My fingers brushed against smooth, cold leather. I grabbed it and pulled it into the light. It was the blue ledger. My hands shook violently as I opened the thick cover. The pages were filled with Richard's precise, neat handwriting. Columns of numbers, dates, and bank routing codes were documented with absolute clarity. Attached to the inside cover was a heavy silver key to a safety deposit box at the downtown bank. Beside the key was a folded piece of white paper. I quickly unfolded the note. It was a handwritten letter from Richard addressed directly to the federal authorities. It detailed exactly how Greg had set up a network of phantom shell companies to siphon millions of dollars out of the logistics corporate accounts. It explained how Beatrice had altered the financial records to hide the missing funds. It was the smoking gun. It was the irrefutable evidence of their massive criminal empire. Tears of profound relief flooded my eyes. I had it. I had the proof that would destroy them and clear Richard's name. I clutched the blue ledger against my chest, feeling a triumphant surge of power. I was going to walk out of this house, drive straight to the bank, and hand this ledger directly to the FBI agents Richard had told me about. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the ledger tightly under my arm. I turned toward the study door, ready to make my escape. But before I could even take a single step forward, a loud, sharp sound echoed through the silent room. Click. It was the heavy, unmistakable sound of a deadbolt sliding firmly into place. I froze, my blood running instantly cold. I stared at the brass door handle. I rushed forward and grabbed the knob, twisting it frantically. It did not budge. The door was locked tight. A shadow passed under the crack at the bottom of the door. Then Beatrice's voice, cold and dripping with absolute venom, echoed through the solid mahogany wood. "Did you really think we were that stupid, Caroline?" Her voice sent a wave of sheer terror crashing over me. I pounded my fist against the heavy wood. "Let me out, Beatrice. Open this door right now. You are exactly where you belong," Beatrice replied from the hallway, her tone mocking and triumphant. "You are a danger to yourself, Caroline. You are hallucinating and destroying Richard's study in a frantic, manic episode. Do not worry, dear. We have already called the professionals. They are on their way to take very good care of you." I stood trapped in the quiet study, clutching the blue ledger as the terrifying reality of my situation set in. I had found the evidence, but I had walked directly into their trap. And judging by the sinister tone of Beatrice's voice, the true nightmare was only just beginning. I stood in the center of the locked study, clutching the blue ledger to my chest. The heavy mahogany door was solid wood. Richard and I had picked it out together 20 years ago to ensure he had a quiet place to work. Now that very same door was my prison. I could hear Beatrice and Greg walking away down the hallway. Their footsteps were heavy and confident. They were laughing. The sound of their cruel, mocking laughter echoed through the silent house and seeped under the doorframe. They actually thought they had won. They thought they had trapped a fragile, terrified old woman who would simply surrender to their demands by morning. I rested my forehead against the cool wood of the door and closed my eyes. I needed to breathe. I needed to focus. Richard was alive. He was out there somewhere waiting for me to secure this evidence. I looked down at the heavy blue ledger in my hands. I ran my fingers over the textured leather cover. Tucked safely inside the pages was the silver key to the safety deposit box. It felt like a lifeline. I walked over to Richard's desk and carefully placed the ledger inside my purse. I zipped it shut with slow, deliberate movements. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times. 3 in the morning. I had a few hours before the sun would rise, and before Greg would wake up to demand my signature on those fraudulent papers. I knew I could not be here when he unlocked that door. I walked over to the large bay window that looked out onto the backyard. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of gray clouds, making the yard pitch black. This was my house. I knew every single inch of it. I knew that the window in the study had a faulty locking mechanism. Richard had been meaning to fix it for months, but we had been so busy with the logistics company that it kept getting pushed down the priority list. I reached out and touched the brass latch. My hands were shaking, but my resolve was absolute iron. I gripped the latch and pulled it upward with all my strength. It resisted at first, stuck with age and disuse. I closed my eyes and prayed silently, asking Richard for strength. I pushed harder, and with a sharp click the latch gave way. I slid the heavy glass pane upward. The cold night air hit my face instantly, freezing the sweat on my forehead. I looked down. The drop to the soft grass below was only about 4 feet. It was not a dangerous fall, but for a woman my age in the pitch dark, it was a terrifying prospect. I threw my purse out first, hearing it land softly on the lawn. Then I climbed onto the windowsill. I swung one leg over the ledge, feeling the cold night breeze bite through my thin black morning skirt. I swung my other leg over, taking a deep breath, and let myself drop. I hit the ground hard, my knees buckled, and I tumbled onto the damp grass. A sharp pain shot up my ankle, but I bit my lip to keep from crying out. I stayed perfectly still on the ground, pressing my face into the wet grass, listening for any sound from inside the house. I waited for a light to flick on. I waited for Greg to yell, but the house remained completely dark and silent. They were fast asleep, dreaming of the fortune they thought they were about to steal from me. I pushed myself up onto my feet and grabbed my purse. I did not dare walk down the driveway where the motion sensor lights would expose me. Instead, I crept through the side gate, moving like a fugitive in my own backyard. I slipped through the shadows, keeping my head down until I reached the main road. The streets of my quiet suburban neighborhood were completely deserted. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows on the pavement. I started walking toward the main avenue, hoping to catch a taxi. My ankle throbbed with every single step, but I refused to slow down. I was driven by a pure, burning adrenaline. I walked for what felt like hours, navigating the dark streets, clutching my purse tightly against my chest. Every time a car drove past, I ducked behind a tree or a parked vehicle, terrified that Greg had woken up and was driving around looking for me. By the time I reached the commercial district, the sky was just beginning to turn a pale, bruised purple. The city was slowly waking up. I found an all-night diner and slipped inside, taking a booth in the far back corner. I ordered a black coffee and sat there watching the clock on the wall tick away the minutes. It was 5 in the morning. The downtown bank did not open until 8. I had 3 agonizing hours to wait. I sat in that booth going over everything in my mind. I thought about the medication they had swapped. I thought about the absolute cruelty in Beatrice's eyes when she demanded my home. They wanted to erase me. They wanted to wipe away 30 years of my life with Richard just to line their own pockets. The anger kept me awake. The anger kept me sharp. I drank my bitter coffee and waited for the sun to rise fully over the city skyline. At 7:30, I left the diner and walked the remaining 4 blocks to the bank. It was a massive, imposing stone building in the center of the financial district. I stood across the street, hiding in the shadow of a bus stop, watching the glass doors. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see Greg's angry face charging toward me. My heart raced with every passing second. I knew he had to be awake by now. He had to have opened the study door and found the empty room and the open window. He would be absolutely furious. He would be tearing the house apart looking for me. Finally, the heavy glass doors of the bank were unlocked by a security guard. I crossed the street almost running and stepped into the grand marble lobby. The air conditioning washed over me, cooling my flushed skin. I walked directly to the main reception desk. The young woman behind the counter looked at me with a polite professional smile. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you today?" "I need to access my safety deposit box," I replied, my voice sounding remarkably steady, despite the frantic beating of my heart. She asked for my identification. I reached into my purse and pulled out my driver license, sliding it across the polished marble counter. She typed my name into her computer. Then I reached into the zippered pocket of my purse and pulled out the heavy silver key I had found in the blue ledger. I placed it on the counter next to my license. The young woman nodded and called for the vault manager. A tall, older man in a tailored suit approached. He greeted me formally and led me toward the back of the bank, away from the main lobby. We walked down a long, quiet corridor lined with secure doors. He used his MasterCard to open a heavy steel gate, leading us directly into the vault room. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with hundreds of small metal doors. "Box number 412, he said, looking at his clipboard. "Right this way, Mrs. Caldwell." I followed him down the narrow aisle. He stopped in front of a box near the bottom left corner. He inserted his master key into one side of the lock and gestured for me to insert my silver key into the other. We turned the keys simultaneously. The lock clicked heavily. He pulled the metal box out and handed it to me. "You can use the private viewing room right behind you," he said, gesturing toward a small enclosed room with a desk and a chair. "Take as much time as you need." I thanked him and carried the heavy metal box into the small room, closing the door behind me. I sat down at the wooden desk and stared at the box. This was it. This was the proof Richard had risked his life to expose. I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. The box was packed with thick manila envelopes. I pulled the first one out and opened it, spreading the documents across the desk under the bright overhead light. They were bank statements. Not from Richard corporate accounts, but from strange international banks with names I did not recognize. I scanned the columns of numbers and dates. My eyes widened in absolute horror as I read the transaction details. There were dozens of wire transfers, each moving hundreds of thousands of dollars out of our logistics company and directly into these offshore accounts. The destination accounts were all registered to a holding company called Horizon Enterprises. I dug deeper into the box and found the incorporation papers for Horizon Enterprises. The sole managing directors listed on the legal documents were Gregory Caldwell and Beatrice Caldwell. My hands started to shake uncontrollably. I was looking at a massive coordinated theft. Over the course of 2 years, Greg and Beatrice had systematically siphoned more than $8 million out of Richard business. They had bled the company dry, hiding the money in foreign accounts where Richard would never find it. They had done it slowly at first, masking the transfers as legitimate vendor payments and consulting fees. Beatrice had used her access to the corporate tax software to doctor the quarterly financial reports, making the company look like it was hemorrhaging money to legitimate creditors. I pulled out another envelope. This one was labeled in Richard handwriting. The label read, "Fraudulent Deeds and Estate Plans." I opened it and pulled out a stack of heavily notarized legal documents. I read the first page and felt the blood drain completely from my face. It was a revised last will and testament for Richard, but it was entirely forged. The signature at the bottom looked exactly like Richard's handwriting, but I knew it was a fake. I had managed our joint accounts for 3 decades. I knew every curve and loop of his signature. This one was too perfect, too stiff. It lacked his natural fluid motion. The forged will explicitly disinherited me. It stated that due to marital difficulties and my supposed financial incompetence, Richard was leaving his entire company, the house, and all his liquid assets directly to Greg and Beatrice. It was a completely fabricated document designed to leave me absolutely penniless. I kept reading, moving to the next document in the stack. My stomach twisted into a violent, painful knot. It was a power of attorney form granting Greg total control over my personal retirement accounts and my 401k. The document claimed that I was suffering from severe early onset dementia and was legally unfit to manage my own finances. Attached to the power of attorney was a signed affidavit from a doctor I had never even met validating my supposed mental decline. They had planned to steal my retirement fund. They had forged a medical evaluation to declare me insane so they could legally plunder the money I had saved from 30 years of hard work. I sat back in the chair, gasping for air. The sheer magnitude of their evil was staggering. This was not a simple family dispute over a house. This was a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. They had orchestrated a hostile takeover of our entire lives. They had poisoned my husband, forged his will, stole his money, and were preparing to lock me in a psychiatric ward just to cover their tracks. They wanted to destroy me completely, so I could never stand in their way. I stared at the offshore bank statements and the forged medical affidavits. The evidence was irrefutable. It was black and white, cold, hard proof of their extortion fraud and attempted murder. If they had found the blue ledger in the study last night, they would have burned all of this. They would have destroyed the only evidence that could expose their massive criminal empire. They would have won. I carefully gathered all the documents and placed them securely back into the manila envelopes. I placed the envelopes into my purse, making sure the zipper was completely shut tight. I locked the empty metal box and walked out of the viewing room to hand it back to the vault manager. I thanked him politely, keeping my expression perfectly calm. As I walked out of the bank and stepped into the bright morning sunlight, I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I turned the screen on. I had 27 missed calls from Greg and 14 text messages from Beatrice. They were furious. They were panicking. They knew I had escaped the locked study, and they knew their entire plan was suddenly in jeopardy. I did not call them back. I held my purse tightly against my chest, feeling the heavy weight of the documents inside. I had the power now. I had the evidence that would send them to federal prison for the rest of their miserable lives. The terrified, helpless widow they had tried to bully and gaslight was officially gone. I hailed a taxi on the corner of the street and gave the driver my home address. It was time to go back to the house. It was time to face them. I sat in the back of the taxi as it navigated through the morning traffic. I watched the city wake up around me, feeling an immense clarity that I had not felt since the moment Richard collapsed in our kitchen. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in the bottom of my heart, but it was no longer crushing me. It had hardened into something solid and unbreakable. Greg and Beatrice thought they held all the cards. They thought they had backed me into a corner where my only option was to surrender my home and my future. They believed their own lies so deeply that they never anticipated I would fight back. They underestimated the bond I shared with Richard. We had built our lives together from nothing. We knew how to survive. The taxi turned onto my quiet suburban street. The manicured lawns and peaceful front porches looked exactly the same as they did yesterday, but my entire perspective had shifted. I was returning to a war zone. I knew Greg would be waiting for me. I knew he would try to intimidate me, use his physical size and loud voice to break my resolve. I knew Beatrice would hurl insults and try to shred my confidence, but I was no longer afraid of them. I patted my purse, feeling the solid reassurance of the bank statements and the forged documents. They were walking into a trap of their own making. I paid the taxi driver and stepped out onto the sidewalk. I looked at my house. The front door was closed, but I could feel the hostile energy radiating from behind the wood. I stood tall, rolling my shoulders back and taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. I walked up my driveway, ready to finish this. Every step I took toward the front porch was a step away from the victim they wanted me to be. I thought about the forged medical evaluation declaring me incompetent. I thought about how easily they had planned to erase my sanity to steal my retirement savings. They wanted to lock me away in a facility where no one would listen to me while they lived a life of luxury funded by Richard hard work. The absolute depravity of their scheme fueled every step I took. I reached the bottom of the porch stairs. I did not bother looking for my keys because Greg had stolen them from me the night before. I simply walked up the wooden steps and stood in front of the heavy oak door. I raised my hand and knocked loudly 3 times. I did not cower. I did not hesitate. I stood perfectly still, waiting for the monsters to open the door. The great escape was over. Now the real reckoning was about to begin. The taxi ride back to my house felt like a journey between 2 entirely different dimensions. I sat in the back seat with my hands resting firmly over my leather purse. Inside that purse were the manila envelopes containing the absolute proof of my in-laws' criminal empire, the offshore bank statements, the forged medical affidavits, the fabricated will that was designed to leave me destitute. The heavy weight of those documents pressed against my lap, giving me a strange, comforting sense of power. The terrified, grieving widow who had climbed out of a study window in the middle of the night no longer existed. In her place sat a woman who finally understood the sheer depth of the evil she was fighting. I watched the city streets blur past the taxi window. The morning sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the glass storefronts and warming the interior of the car. It was a beautiful day in our quiet suburban town. People were walking their dogs and watering their lawns, completely unaware of the massive multi-million-dollar conspiracy unfolding just a few miles away. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air from the air conditioning vent dry the remaining tears on my cheeks. I knew exactly what I was walking into. I knew Greg and Beatrice would be waiting for me. They would be furious that I had escaped their locked room. They would be desperate to regain control over me before their plan unraveled. I also knew I had to maintain my performance. If I walked up to my front door looking confident and empowered, they would immediately know I had found the blue ledger. They would realize I possessed the evidence to destroy them, and they would panic. I could not let them panic. I needed them to feel completely arrogant and secure. I needed them to believe they had cornered a weak, helpless old woman. That was the only way they would expose themselves entirely. The taxi turned onto my familiar tree-lined street. I saw the large oak tree Richard and I had planted when we first bought the property. I saw the blooming hydrangea bushes I had meticulously cared for every spring. It was my sanctuary. It was the physical manifestation of 30 years of love and hard work. But as the taxi pulled up to the curb, my heart suddenly seized in my chest. The peaceful illusion of my home was violently shattered by the sight waiting for me on the front porch. I paid the driver and stepped out onto the sidewalk, my eyes fixed on the entrance of my house. Stacked carelessly against the pristine white pillars of my porch were 3 large black garbage bags. Sitting next to them was an old battered suitcase I recognized from the attic. My belongings. They had packed up my belongings in garbage bags like I was worthless trash being thrown out on collection day. I walked slowly up the driveway, feeling a fresh wave of nausea wash over me. The sheer disrespect was breathtaking. As I got closer, I could see the neck of a soft pink sweater sticking out of one of the loosely tied plastic bags. It was the cashmere sweater Richard had given me for my birthday last year. Beside it lay a framed photograph of my parents, the glass cracked from being tossed carelessly onto the hard concrete. They had not just packed my clothes. They had desecrated the things I held most dear. They were sending a loud, clear message that my presence in this house had been completely eradicated. My hands began to shake, but this time it was not from fear. It was from a deep, burning fury that threatened to consume my careful disguise. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, forcing myself to push the anger down into the deepest part of my soul. I needed to act broken. I needed to look like a woman whose spirit had been entirely crushed. I let my shoulders slump forward. I allowed my lower lip to tremble, and I let fresh tears well up in my eyes. I clutched my purse tightly against my ribs and walked up the 3 wooden steps to the porch. I reached out to grab the brass handle of the front door. I pulled down, but it did not move. I tried again, pulling harder. The heavy oak door was completely locked. I instinctively reached into my pocket for my house keys before remembering that Greg had aggressively snatched them from my hands the night before. I was officially locked out of the home I had owned for 2.5 decades. The absolute efficiency of their malice was terrifying. They had not only locked me out, but they had clearly changed the deadbolts. I could see the shiny new metal of the lock cylinder gleaming in the morning light. They had called a locksmith at the crack of dawn just to ensure I could not get back inside. I raised my fist and knocked on the door. I knocked softly at first, playing the part of the timid, frightened victim. When no one answered, I knocked a little louder. I could hear heavy footsteps echoing in the foyer. The sound of thick leather shoes striking the hardwood floor sent a chill down my spine. The deadbolt clicked with a heavy metallic thud. The door swung open and Greg's immense frame completely filled the doorway. He was wearing a crisp, dark suit, looking more like a corporate executioner than a grieving brother. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked intensely satisfied. Behind him, hovering like a venomous shadow in the hallway, stood Beatrice. She was holding a china teacup, sipping her morning tea, as if she were a queen surveying a conquered territory. I looked at the two of them, feeling the solid weight of the evidence in my purse pressing against my heart. "What is the meaning of this, Greg?" I asked, letting my voice crack and waver. "Why are my things in garbage bags on the porch? Why is the door locked? I live here." Greg let out a long, exaggerated sigh. He crossed his massive arms over his chest and looked down at me with a mixture of fake pity and utter contempt. He spoke loudly, making sure his voice carried over the porch and down the street. He was performing for any neighbors who might have their windows open. He was establishing his twisted narrative for the world to hear. "Caroline, we are so incredibly worried about you," Greg announced, his voice dripping with artificial concern. "You disappeared in the middle of the night. We woke up this morning to check on you and found the guest room completely empty. We found the study window wide open. You climbed out of a window in the pitch-black dark like a lunatic and went wandering the streets. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is for a woman in your fragile mental state?" I stared at him, letting my mouth hang open in feigned shock. "I did not climb out of a window because I am crazy, Greg," I whispered loudly enough for him to hear my supposed desperation. "I climbed out because Beatrice locked me inside that room. You trapped me in there." Beatrice stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She shook her head slowly, offering me a look of profound, patronizing sorrow. "Oh, Caroline," she murmured sweetly, "listen to yourself. You are completely delusional. Why on earth would I lock you in a room? You are suffering from a severe grief-induced psychosis. You are hallucinating things that never happened. We found you wandering the streets in a fugue state. You do not even know what day it is, do you?" I shook my head, frantically clutching my purse tighter. "I know exactly what day it is, Beatrice. I know exactly what you are doing. Please just let me back into my house. I need to rest. I need to be in my own bed." Greg stepped forward, blocking the doorway entirely. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes and dropped the pretense of the concerned brother-in-law. The loud, theatrical voice vanished, replaced by a low, menacing growl, intended only for my ears. "You do not have a bed here anymore," Caroline Gregg stated flatly. "You do not have a house. You are a danger to yourself and a massive liability to this family estate. While you were out roaming the city making a fool of yourself, we took the necessary steps to secure this property. The locks have been changed. Your belongings have been removed. We have officially taken over this residence for your own good and for the protection of Richard's legacy." I took a step back, letting my eyes widen in sheer terror. "You cannot do this," I sobbed, allowing genuine-looking tears to spill over my cheeks. "You have no right. The house belongs to me. Richard left this house to me. Richard died bankrupt," Greg snapped, cutting me off with brutal efficiency. "He owed me millions, and this property is the only collateral left to satisfy that debt. We tried to do this the easy way yesterday, Caroline. We gave you the opportunity to sign the quitclaim deed with a shred of dignity. But your erratic behavior last night proved that you are completely unfit to manage even the simplest affairs. You forced our hand. We had to take immediate protective action before you burned the place down or hurt someone in your crazed delusions." Beatrice moved to stand right beside Greg. She looked at the garbage bags on the porch and then back at my tear-stained face. She smiled a small, vicious smile that conveyed pure, absolute hatred. "We always knew you were weak," Caroline Beatrice whispered, her voice laced with venom. "We always knew you were never smart enough to handle a man like Richard or the wealth he created. You were nothing but a temporary fixture in his life, and now that he is gone, we are correcting his mistake. The money, the house, the company, it all belongs to the real bloodline. It belongs to us." I looked down at the concrete porch, letting my shoulders shake with fake sobs. Inside my mind, I was matching their account numbers to their names, calculating exactly how many years they would spend in a federal penitentiary for their crimes. I knew the FBI was listening to this exact conversation through the wiretaps they had set up. I knew that every single cruel word Beatrice and Greg spoke was digging their graves deeper and deeper. But I had to play the game until the very end. I had to let them present their final trap. "Please, Greg," I pleaded, looking up at him with wide, terrified eyes. "I have nowhere else to go. All my money is tied up in the joint accounts. My retirement savings are all I have left. Please do not do this to me. I will be quiet. I will stay out of your way. Just let me back inside my home." Greg uncrossed his arms and leaned casually against the doorframe. The smug satisfaction radiating from his pores was almost suffocating. He enjoyed watching me beg. He relished the feeling of holding my entire life in the palm of his hand. He looked past me, scanning the quiet suburban street, before bringing his dark eyes back to my face. "You have two choices, Caroline," Greg said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute whisper. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He held it out toward me, but kept it just out of my reach. "This is a comprehensive power of attorney," he explained coldly. "It grants me total legal control over your finances, your health care directives, and your retirement accounts. If you walk inside right now, sit at the dining room table and sign this document, we will let you take your garbage bags and walk away. We will even call you a cab to a cheap motel across town. You will walk away with absolutely nothing, but you will keep your freedom." I stared at the document, my heart pounding. And if I refuse, I asked, my voice trembling so hard it barely registered above a whisper, "What happens if I do not sign that paper, Greg?" Greg smiled a cold, terrifying smile that showed all of his teeth. He raised his hand and pointed a thick finger over my shoulder toward the end of the street. I slowly turned my head, following his gaze. Parked at the corner of my quiet neighborhood street, partially hidden by the shade of a large oak tree, was a white ambulance. The engine was idling quietly. The red and white lights on the roof were spinning silently, casting an eerie, sinister glow against the morning shadows. 2 large men in paramedic uniforms were standing outside the vehicle smoking cigarettes and looking directly at my house. "If you refuse to sign the power of attorney," Greg said, his voice devoid of any human empathy, "we wave our hands and call those men up to the porch. They are waiting for my signal, Caroline. We have spent the last 2 days building a very convincing case that you are suffering from a severe, dangerous psychotic break. You are a grieving widow who is hallucinating hearing voices and wandering the streets at dawn." Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with wicked delight. "We already have a doctor's signature, Caroline," she added proudly. "A very respected psychiatrist has already signed the mandatory psychiatric hold paperwork based on our detailed family testimony regarding your mental decline. You are legally certifiable as of this morning." Greg tapped the legal document against his palm. The trap was perfectly laid. They had covered every single angle. They were going to steal my entire life and throw me in a locked ward to rot if I dared to resist. "So here is the reality of your situation, Caroline." Greg concluded, his tone absolute and final. "You have 2 choices. Sign this power of attorney and walk away with nothing, or we call the paramedics waiting down the street to take you to a psychiatric ward. We already have a doctor's signature. Choose wisely, widow, because this is the last decision you will ever make as a free woman." Greg stood on my porch like a giant shadow blocking the morning sun. His thick finger was still pointing toward the white ambulance parked at the end of the street. I looked at the 2 large paramedics leaning against the hood of the vehicle. They were drinking coffee and laughing, completely unaware that they were being used as instruments of terror. Or perhaps they were fully aware and simply did not care. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "You have 2 choices, Caroline," Greg had said. "Sign the power of attorney or go to a psychiatric ward." My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I clutched my leather purse tightly against my stomach, feeling the solid weight of the bank statements and the forged documents hidden inside. They were my only shield. I knew I had to play their twisted game just a little longer. I took a deep, trembling breath and let my shoulders slump forward, perfectly mimicking the posture of a defeated, broken woman. I looked up at Greg with wide, terrified eyes. "Please, Greg," I whispered, letting my voice crack with manufactured fear. "Please do not send me away. I will do whatever you want. I will sign the papers. Just let me stay in my own home for 1 more day." A slow, malicious smile spread across his face. He looked at Beatrice, who was standing behind him, clutching her teacup with triumphant satisfaction. She nodded slightly, a silent confirmation that they had completely broken my spirit. Greg stepped aside and made a sweeping gesture with his arm, inviting me into the house I had owned for 25 years. "Good choice, Caroline," he said, his voice dripping with condescending approval. "Come inside. We have some guests waiting for you in the dining room. They are here to make sure this transition goes as smoothly as possible." I walked past him, stepping over the threshold of my own front door. The air inside the house felt thick and stale. The familiar scent of vanilla and cedar wood that Richard and I had always loved was completely gone, replaced by the sterile, sharp odor of cheap cologne and betrayal. I walked slowly down the hallway, my legs feeling as heavy as lead. Beatrice followed closely behind me, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor like the ticking of a countdown clock. I turned the corner and walked into the formal dining room. The sight that greeted me made my stomach churn with absolute disgust. Sitting at my beautiful mahogany dining table, the table where Richard and I had hosted countless Thanksgiving dinners and quiet Sunday brunches, were 2 men I had never seen before. They looked up as I entered, their eyes scanning me with cold, clinical detachment. The man sitting on the left was older, with thinning gray hair and a sharp, angular face. He wore an expensive tailored suit and had a stack of thick legal files spread out across my lace tablecloth. The man on the right was younger, perhaps in his late 40s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a soft, condescending smile permanently plastered on his face. He held a silver pen and a leather-bound notepad. Greg walked into the room and pulled out a chair at the head of the table, pointing for me to sit down. "Caroline, I want to introduce you to two very important people," Greg announced. "This is Mr. Sterling, our corporate attorney, and this is Dr. Harrison, a highly respected psychiatrist who specializes in grief counseling and elder care. They're here to help us protect you." I sat down slowly, placing my purse carefully on my lap. I kept my hands folded tightly over the leather, making sure the zipper was completely secure. I looked at the two men sitting across from me. They were not here to help me. They were hired mercenaries brought in to execute a hostile takeover of my entire life. Dr. Harrison leaned forward, resting his elbows on my dining table. He looked at me with an expression of exaggerated pity. "Good morning, Caroline," he said in a soft, soothing voice that made my skin crawl. "Greg and Beatrice have told me so much about you. They are incredibly worried about your well-being. Losing a spouse is a devastating trauma, and it is completely normal to feel confused or overwhelmed. But your family tells me you have been experiencing some very distressing symptoms lately." I stared at him, keeping my breathing steady. I knew exactly what he was doing. This was the mock wellness check. This was the performance they needed to legally justify stripping me of my rights. "What kind of symptoms, Dr. Harrison?" I asked, keeping my voice low and hesitant. The doctor clicked his silver pen and looked down at his notepad. "Well, Caroline, Greg mentioned that you have been wandering the house in the middle of the night. He said you have been speaking to your late husband as if he were still alive. Beatrice also noted that you seem highly paranoid and that you have been accusing your family of conspiring against you. These are classic signs of a severe stress-induced psychotic break. We need to evaluate your cognitive function to ensure you are not a danger to yourself." The sheer audacity of the lie left me momentarily breathless. They had fabricated an entire medical history based on my desperate attempts to find the truth. I looked at Greg, who was leaning against the dining room wall with his arms crossed, watching the scene with absolute smug satisfaction. Beatrice sat in the corner sipping her tea, pretending to look like a heartbroken mother-in-law. I turned my attention back to the corrupt psychiatrist. "I am not hallucinating, Dr. Harrison," I said, my voice growing a fraction louder. "I know exactly what is happening in this house. My husband did not leave this company bankrupt. Greg and Beatrice have been siphoning millions of dollars out of the logistics corporate accounts. They have been funneling the money into offshore banks under a fake holding company called Horizon Enterprises." The room fell completely silent. Greg stiffened his posture, rigid. Beatrice lowered her teacup, her eyes widening in sudden shock. Dr. Harrison, however, did not miss a beat. He simply shook his head and began writing furiously in his leather notepad. "You see, Caroline," he said, using that same patronizing tone, "this is exactly what we are talking about. You are constructing complex paranoid delusions to avoid processing the reality of your husband passing. You are inventing financial conspiracies because accepting the truth of his bankruptcy is simply too painful for your fragile mind to handle." I felt a surge of pure molten rage tear through my chest. "I am not inventing anything," I protested, gripping my purse tightly. "I have proof. I know about the forged medical evaluations. I know about the fake will. They are trying to steal my home and my retirement savings." Dr. Harrison let out a long, dramatic sigh. He looked at Greg and gave a subtle, grim nod. Severe paranoid delusions accompanied by grandiosity and acute persecution mania. He stated clinically, as if I were a fascinating specimen in a jar. He looked back at me, his eyes cold and unfeeling. Caroline, your condition is far worse than we initially feared. You are completely detached from reality. You are making wild, baseless accusations against the very people who are trying to save you. This level of psychosis requires immediate long-term residential treatment. I felt the walls of the dining room begin to close in on me. The physical sensation of claustrophobia was overwhelming. I was sitting in the very house Richard and I had built together, surrounded by the beautiful things we had collected over a lifetime of love. The antique grandfather clock ticked rhythmically in the hallway. The sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, illuminating the polished wood of the table. But the house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a meticulously designed prison. I was completely trapped, surrounded by enemies who held all the keys to my destruction. Greg pushed himself off the wall and walked slowly toward the table. He stood directly behind my chair, casting a dark, heavy shadow over me. "You see," Caroline, Greg whispered, his voice a low, rumbling threat. "You are sick. You are very, very sick. And we cannot in good conscience allow you to manage your own affairs while you are in this tragic state of mental decline. It would be negligent of us as your loving family." Beatrice chimed in from the corner, her voice dripping with artificial sorrow. "We only want what is best for you, dear. We want you to be safe and comfortable in a facility where trained professionals can monitor your delusions around the clock. You clearly cannot distinguish fact from fiction anymore." Mr. Sterling, the corrupt family lawyer, finally spoke up. He cleared his throat and slid a massive stack of legal documents across the polished table. The thick white pages rested directly in front of me, pristine and deadly. He pulled a heavy gold fountain pen from his breast pocket and placed it deliberately next to the papers. "Mrs. Caldwell." Mr. Sterling began, his voice crisp and completely devoid of emotion. "Given the professional medical assessment provided by Dr. Harrison, we have drafted the necessary legal instruments to secure your estate. These documents will transfer full durable power of attorney to your brother-in-law, Gregory Caldwell. This will allow him to manage your healthcare decisions, your property assets, and your financial accounts while you receive the psychiatric care you so desperately require." I stared at the documents. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, "Irrevocable power of attorney and transfer of assets." My hands shook as I reached out and gently touched the edge of the paper. "What exactly am I signing away, Mr. Sterling?" I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on the documents. I needed them to explicitly state their crimes. I needed to hear the full extent of their greed. Mr. Sterling adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked at me with the boredom of a man swatting a fly. "You are transferring the deed to this property," he explained methodically. "You are also transferring control of your joint checking and savings accounts, your personal 401k retirement fund, and your husband life insurance policy. Since Richard died with immense corporate debt, these assets must be liquidated immediately to satisfy the creditors. Gregory will handle the distribution of these funds to protect you from any legal liability." I felt my stomach twist into a tight, painful knot. The life insurance policy. Richard had a massive life insurance policy designed to ensure I would be completely taken care of if anything ever happened to him. They were taking that too. They were leaving me with absolutely nothing. They were going to strip me bare, throw me into a locked psychiatric ward, and live like royalty on the money my husband had spent his entire life earning. I looked around the room. I looked at Dr. Harrison, who was calmly reviewing his notes. I looked at Mr. Sterling, who was waiting patiently for his commission. I looked at Beatrice, who was smiling with naked, predatory greed. And I looked up at Greg, who was standing over me like an executioner waiting for the blade to drop. The sheer volume of their corruption was suffocating. They had bought and paid for every single person in this room. They had weaponized the legal system and the medical profession to execute a flawless, untraceable robbery. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, picturing Richard's face. I remembered his kind eyes and his strong, capable hands. I remembered the way he laughed when we first bought this house, standing in the empty dining room and dreaming about the future. They had taken him from me. They had poisoned him and watched him die so they could sit at this very table and divide the spoils of his life. The anger that had been simmering in my chest began to boil over, transforming into a white-hot, blinding fury. But I could not let it show. I had to remain the frightened, confused victim. I had to let them believe their flawless plan had worked perfectly. I opened my eyes and let a single tear roll down my cheek. I looked at the gold fountain pen resting on the table. It looked incredibly heavy. It looked like an instrument of my own demise. "But why do you need my life insurance money, Greg?" I asked, my voice trembling with a pathetic whimper. "That money was for my future. How am I supposed to survive if you take everything?" Greg leaned down, placing his large hands flat on the dining table, trapping me between his arms. His face was only inches from mine. "You will survive because we will pay for your room at the psychiatric facility, Caroline." He sneered softly. "We will make sure you have 3 meals a day and a nice soft bed in a locked ward. You do not need money where you are going. You only need supervision. And if you refuse to sign these papers right now, we will let the state take everything. We will call those paramedics outside and have you committed involuntarily. The state will drain your accounts to pay for your care, and you will still end up with nothing. Sign the papers, Caroline. Make it easy on yourself." I looked at the stack of documents again. The neat rows of legal jargon blurred together in front of my eyes. The sheer claustrophobia of the moment pressed down on me like a physical weight. The air in the dining room was completely stagnant. I could smell the sharp ink on the paper, the stale coffee in Beatrice's cup, and the cloying scent of fear they expected me to exude. Every exit was blocked. The front door was locked. The windows were shut. I was entirely surrounded by monsters wearing human skin. Dr. Harrison tapped his silver pen against his leather notepad, a sharp, rhythmic sound that echoed in the quiet room. "Caroline," he said softly, urging me forward, "do not fight the inevitable. You are unwell. Your mind is creating these elaborate fantasies about offshore accounts and forged documents because you cannot process your grief. Signing these papers is the first step toward your recovery. It is a relief to let someone else handle the heavy burdens. Let Greg take care of you." I looked at the doctor, marveling at his ability to lie with such effortless conviction. He was a licensed medical professional, a man sworn to heal and protect. Yet here he was, actively participating in the psychological destruction of an innocent woman simply because Greg had offered him enough money. I wondered how many other families he had helped destroy. I wondered how many other perfectly sane elderly people were currently locked away in horrible facilities because Dr. Harrison had gladly signed a piece of paper declaring them unfit. The evil in this room was so profound, it felt like a living, breathing entity. Beatrice stood up from her chair in the corner and walked slowly toward the table. She placed her empty teacup on the polished mahogany wood and looked down at me with absolute triumph. 30 years, Caroline," she whispered, her voice laced with deep, bitter resentment. "For 30 years I had to watch you play the perfect wife. I had to watch Richard shower you with gifts and affection while he ignored his own blood family. You thought you were so much better than us. You thought you were safe in this beautiful house with your beautiful life. But you were always just a temporary guest. You never truly belonged here. And now the universe is finally correcting that mistake. The house is ours. The money is ours. Your entire life belongs to us. Pick up the pen and sign your name." I slowly reached out my trembling hand, hovering over the gold fountain pen. My fingers brushed against the cool metal. I felt the collective breath of the room hitch in anticipation. Greg leaned closer, his eyes fixed greedily on my hand. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses, preparing to witness the final signature. Beatrice smiled her victory, completely assured. They had me. They had cornered me, isolated me, and broken me. They had gaslit me into appearing insane, hired corrupt professionals to validate their lies, and threatened me with involuntary commitment. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and financial extortion. The dining room chandelier cast a harsh, glaring light over the table, illuminating the thick stack of papers. I could see the exact line where my signature was required. A simple dotted line that would officially end my freedom and hand my entire world over to the people who had murdered my husband. I thought about the blue ledger tucked safely inside my purse, resting heavy and solid on my lap. I thought about the offshore bank statements and the forged will I had retrieved from the safety deposit box just a few hours ago. The very evidence that proved every single word I had said was the absolute truth. I was holding the literal key to their destruction right in my hands while they stood around me gloating over my supposed defeat. The irony was exquisite, but the danger was incredibly real. If I refused to sign, they would signal the paramedics waiting outside. They would physically drag me out of my home, strap me to a gurney, and pump me full of sedatives. Once I was locked inside a psychiatric ward, no one would ever believe my story. The police would dismiss my claims as the paranoid ramblings of a certified mental patient. The evidence in my purse would be confiscated by Greg as my legal guardian and promptly destroyed. The offshore accounts would vanish. The holding company would be dissolved. Richard Murder would go entirely unpunished, and they would live happily ever after on our millions. I had to navigate this moment with absolute flawless precision. I let my fingers rest on the gold fountain pen. The metal was smooth and heavy. I picked it up slowly, feeling the weight of it in my palm. I looked at the sharp nib glistening with dark ink. I let my hand shake violently, deliberately, making the pen rattle against the wooden table. Greg let out a quiet sigh of relief. He thought I was finally surrendering. He thought the battle was over. Good. Caroline Gregg whispered, his voice softening into a grotesque parody of comfort. Just sign your name on the dotted line. I promise you will feel so much better once this is all over. We will take you somewhere safe, somewhere quiet, where you can rest your troubled mind. I moved the pen toward the paper. I let the tip hover just a millimeter above the crisp white page. I could feel the intense, focused energy of the 4 people surrounding me. They were completely captivated by the movement of my hand. They were entirely focused on the ink about to touch the paper. They were so blinded by their own greed and arrogance that they could not see the reality of what was actually happening. They were in my house. They were sitting at my table, and they had absolutely no idea that they were already dead. The sheer suffocating claustrophobia of the room, the sterile smell of the corrupt doctor, the sharp cologne of the crooked lawyer, the bitter resentment radiating from Beatrice, and the violent, looming threat of Greg. All of it pressed down on my shoulders. I was a lone woman surrounded by a pack of starving wolves. But I was not the prey. I was the trap. I gripped the gold pen tightly, pretending to gather the last remaining shreds of my broken courage. I looked up from the documents and met Greg Gaze playing the terrified, defeated widow one last, final time. I let a ragged sob escape my lips and lowered my head toward the paper. The dining room felt entirely different than it ever had before. For 25 years, this space had been the heart of my home. It was the room where Richard and I had hosted warm holiday dinners and shared quiet Sunday mornings with steaming mugs of coffee. The rich mahogany table had always been a place of comfort and joy. Now it felt like a cold stone execution block. I was seated in my usual chair, but I was completely surrounded by enemies. Greg stood directly behind me, his massive frame casting a heavy, suffocating shadow over my shoulders. He breathed loudly, his presence a constant physical threat that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Across the wide, polished table sat the 2 corrupt professionals they had hired to legitimize this nightmare. Dr. Harrison adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and projected a sickening aura of fake medical concern while his pen hovered over a leather notepad. Next to him, Mr. Sterling, the crooked family attorney, drummed his manicured fingers against his expensive briefcase. He had placed a thick stack of legal documents right in front of me. The bold black letters at the top of the crisp white pages demanded the complete transfer of my home, my retirement savings, and my husband's life insurance policy. The sheer claustrophobia of the moment pressed down on my chest like a physical weight. The air in the room was entirely stagnant. It smelled of bitter coffee, cheap cologne, and the metallic tang of pure, unadulterated greed. Every exit was blocked. The front door was locked tight, and the windows were shut. I was trapped in the very sanctuary I had spent decades building. They had orchestrated this hostile takeover with terrifying and flawless precision. They had gaslit me into appearing unstable. They had hired a predatory doctor to officially declare me insane. They had brought a ruthless lawyer to make the theft completely binding. And they were all just waiting for me to break. They expected me to collapse into a puddle of weeping submission and sign away my entire life just to escape the relentless psychological torture. I kept my hands folded tightly on my lap, resting them directly over my leather purse. I played the part of the shattered widow to absolute perfection. I let my shoulders slump forward, making myself look small and entirely defeated. I allowed my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let a single tear roll down my cheek and drop onto the dark wood of the table. I needed them to believe that their cruel plan had worked flawlessly. I needed them to feel the absolute certainty of their victory, so they would expose the true depths of their malice. Beatrice stepped out from the shadowy corner of the dining room. Her expensive heels clicked against the hardwood floor with a sharp, rhythmic sound that echoed like a judge striking a gavel. She walked slowly, deliberately, taking her time to savor every single second of her ultimate triumph. She came around the edge of the large table and stood directly beside my chair. The cloying scent of her heavy floral perfume washed over me, making my stomach churn with disgust. She did not look at me with pity or fake sympathy anymore. The thin mask of the grieving mother-in-law had completely vanished. In its place was a look of pure, naked contempt. The deep, bitter resentment she had harbored for decades was finally on full display. She leaned down, bringing her face so close to mine that I could feel the heat of her breath on my cheek. She began to speak in a low, venomous whisper that was intended only for my ears. She told me that she had waited 30 long years for this exact moment. For 3 decades, she had been forced to smile and watch me walk around this beautiful house, acting like I truly belonged here. She said I had always been nothing but a pathetic imposter, a common outsider who had somehow managed to trick her highly successful son into marriage. Richard was a brilliant, wealthy man. She whispered, her voice dripping with poison, but he was completely blind and foolish when it came to you. She told me how much she despised my cooking my clothes and the way I decorated the house. She said she hated watching Richard shower me with expensive gifts and constant affection while he ignored the financial needs of his own blood family. He bought you this magnificent home and gave you a life of luxury while his real family had to settle for scraps. She hissed, her eyes narrowing with vicious hatred. She sneered at my tear-stained face and told me I was nothing but a temporary parasite feeding off the Caldwell family legacy. The hatred in her voice was a heavy, suffocating burden bearing down on me. She said that Richard Money, his prosperous company, and his valuable assets were always meant to belong to his true bloodline. Greg was his only brother and she was his mother. They were the rightful owners of everything Richard had built with his bare hands. She told me I had served my purpose by keeping his house clean and playing the dutiful little wife, but my contract had officially expired the moment his heart stopped beating. The universe is finally correcting a massive 30-year mistake, she whispered. The money and the property belong to the real blood of this family. She reached out and picked up the heavy gold fountain pen that Mr. Sterling had placed on the table. She pressed the cold metal forcefully into my trembling palm. Her long, manicured fingers curled tightly around mine, forcing me to grip the pen. She told me to stop dragging this out and to accept my inevitable defeat. She told me I should be incredibly grateful they were even allowing me to go to a psychiatric ward, instead of throwing me out onto the concrete streets to starve like a stray dog. She ordered me to sign the papers because I was absolutely powerless to stop them, and my time in this family was permanently over. Just as her cruel words hung in the stagnant air of the dining room, a low rumbling sound drifted in from the quiet street outside. It was the heavy idle of a large diesel engine. The sound grew steadily louder as the vehicle slowly turned into my long circular driveway. I could hear the heavy tires crushing the gravel just outside the front window. Greg let out a low, satisfied chuckle from his position behind my chair. He stepped away from me and walked over to the large bay window, pulling back the sheer white curtains with a dramatic flourish. The bright morning sunlight was instantly pierced by rhythmic flashes of intense red and white light. The strobe effect cut directly through the window glass and danced wildly across the dining room walls. The flashing emergency lights washed over Beatrice, smug face, turning her pale skin alternating shades of violent crimson and ghostly white. The harsh beams reflected off Dr. Harrison wire-rimmed glasses and made Mr. Sterling leather briefcase gleam in the blinding glare. The ambulance had arrived. Greg had given the silent signal. The corrupt paramedics he had hired were parking their vehicle right outside my front door. The reality of the threat was no longer just an abstract concept discussed in the shadows. It was sitting right in my driveway with its lights spinning, warning the entire peaceful neighborhood of a fabricated medical emergency. The red and white beams pulsed across the mahogany table, illuminating the irrevocable power of attorney documents waiting for my signature. Greg turned back to face me, his dark silhouette framed by the flashing lights. He told me the paramedics had a gurney ready and waiting on the front porch. He said they had a powerful chemical sedative already drawn up in a syringe, prepared to calm down a hysterical, grieving widow who was having a severe paranoid psychotic break. He told me they would strap my arms and legs down, carry me out of my own home in front of all my watching neighbors, and lock me in a windowless, padded room for the rest of my natural life. He said Dr. Harrison had already signed the mandatory commitment papers, making the entire abduction perfectly legal and completely irreversible. The tension in the dining room reached an absolute suffocating peak. The red and white lights continued their frantic dance across the walls, serving as a silent, terrifying countdown to my total destruction. Mr. Sterling tapped the legal document, pointing explicitly to the dotted line where my signature was required. Dr. Harrison clicked his pen again, reminding me that my medical fate was entirely in his corrupt hands. Beatrice leaned in even closer, her voice a harsh, demanding hiss, commanding me to make my final choice. She told me to sign the document immediately and walk away with the garbage bag full of old clothes they had left on the porch. If I refused, she promised I would be carried out in a straitjacket, completely stripped of my dignity. She told me to choose between being poor and free on the streets, or being a heavily medicated prisoner in a state-run asylum. Sign the papers, Caroline, or lose your freedom forever. She whispered, her eyes shining with pure malicious victory. The sheer terror of the psychiatric ward loomed over me like a dark, heavy storm cloud. I knew exactly what happened to elderly people who were forcibly committed with no outside family to advocate for them. They vanished into the cold clinical system. They were drugged until their minds turned to mush, and they lost all sense of identity. They were entirely forgotten by the outside world. Greg and Beatrice had orchestrated the ultimate inescapable trap. They had covered every single exit and locked every single door. They believed they had me completely cornered and entirely at their mercy. I sat frozen in the antique chair, clutching the gold fountain pen as the red lights flashed rhythmically against the paperwork. The men standing around me were waiting for me to break completely. They expected me to collapse into a puddle of weeping submission. They fully expected me to beg for mercy and hastily scribble my name on the dotted line just to save myself from the waiting ambulance and the men with the sedatives. They believed their relentless psychological torture had completely dismantled my spirit and erased my courage. They believed they were looking at a weak, broken old woman who had finally realized she was entirely defeated. But as the red and white emergency lights pulsed across the room, the freezing terror in my chest began to miraculously evaporate. The suffocating panic that had been choking my throat suddenly dissolved, leaving behind a crystal-clear freezing focus. I felt the heavy, solid weight of my leather purse resting securely on my lap. Inside that purse, hidden safely beneath the dark fabric, was the blue ledger I had recovered from the study. Inside that purse were the offshore bank statements, proving Greg and Beatrice had systematically stolen millions from the logistics company. Inside that purse was the forged will and the fraudulent medical affidavits they had created to steal my life. I had the absolute irrefutable proof of their massive criminal empire resting right on my knees. I had the smoking gun that would tear their entire lives to pieces and vindicate my husband. They thought they had me perfectly surrounded, but they had actually walked willingly and blindly into my snare. The corrupt doctor, the crooked lawyer, the arrogant brother-in-law, and the venomous mother-in-law were all standing in my dining room, freely admitting to their vast extortion. They had brought the fraudulent legal documents right to my table. They had parked their fake medical transport in my driveway. They had provided me with every single piece of evidence the federal authorities needed to lock them all away in a maximum security penitentiary for decades. The trap had not closed on me. It had closed tightly and permanently on them. The sheer poetic justice of the moment filled me with a quiet, burning, immense power. I stopped looking at the terrifying flashing lights bouncing off the wall. I stopped shrinking away from Greg, aggressive looming shadow. I stopped cowering beneath Beatrice's hateful gaze. I tightened my grip on the heavy gold fountain pen. My hand completely stopped trembling. The elaborate performance of the terrified victim was officially over. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the clean air fill my lungs and steady my racing heart. I sat up perfectly straight in my chair, pushing my shoulders back and lifting my chin with absolute authority. I looked at the power of attorney documents sitting on the table, acknowledging the massive theft they had attempted. Then I slowly turned my head and looked directly into Beatrice's cold, calculating eyes. The look of supreme triumph on her face faltered for a fraction of a second as she noticed the sudden drastic change in my posture. The fake tears were gone. The manufactured fear was completely erased. I did not cry. I did not beg for my freedom. Instead, I let a slow, genuine, and utterly confident smile spread across my face. "You forgot one thing about me, Beatrice," I said, my voice perfectly steady and cold as ice. I sat frozen in the antique dining chair, with the heavy gold fountain pen resting lightly between my trembling fingers. The smooth metal of the pen felt cold and foreign against my skin, a stark contrast to the boiling heat radiating throughout my entire body. Outside the large bay window, the flashing red and white lights of the ambulance continued their frantic rhythm. The bright beams sliced through the sheer white curtains, painting the walls of my dining room with violent splashes of crimson and ghostly pale light. The strobing colors washed over the faces of the 4 people surrounding me, giving them a sinister, almost demonic appearance. Greg stood directly behind me, his massive frame casting a suffocating shadow over my shoulders. I could hear his heavy, ragged breathing. He was waiting like a starving predator for me to break. He expected me to press the sharp nib of the pen against the crisp white paper and sign away my home, my money, and my very existence. Beatrice stood in the far corner of the room, her expensive heels planted firmly on the hardwood floor. A look of absolute triumphant satisfaction was carved deeply into her powdered face. She held her delicate china teacup with both hands, sipping her tea as if she were celebrating a grand, magnificent victory. Dr. Harrison, the corrupt psychiatrist, hired to orchestrate my demise, sat across from me, tapping his fingers rhythmically against his leather-bound notepad. He was ready to condemn me to a locked psychiatric ward the very second I showed any resistance. Beside him, Mr. Sterling, the crooked family lawyer, simply stared at his gold watch, completely bored by the total destruction of my life. The air in the room was incredibly thick and stagnant. It smelled of bitter, dark coffee, the sharp metallic tang of fresh ink, and the cloying, sickening scent of Beatrice's heavy, floral perfume. They thought they had backed me into a corner from which there was absolutely no escape. They truly believed I was a fragile, confused old widow who had finally realized she was completely and utterly defeated. I let out a ragged, desperate sob, perfectly mimicking a woman who had just lost her final grueling battle. I lowered my head toward the irrevocable power of attorney document, letting my shoulders shake with manufactured grief. I could feel Greg leaning in closer, his anticipation radiating from him like a foul, suffocating heat. But as the tip of the gold pen hovered just a fraction of an inch above the dotted signature line, the freezing terror inside my chest completely evaporated. It vanished entirely, replaced by a freezing absolute clarity that sharpened every single one of my senses. I did not move the pen any closer to the paper. I simply stopped. My hand grew completely steady. The silence in the dining room stretched out, becoming incredibly heavy and dangerously brittle. I heard Greg shift his weight behind me. He let out a loud, impatient breath, his frustration bubbling to the surface. He told me to stop wasting time and just sign the damn paper. He said the paramedics outside were waiting and he was losing his patience. He warned me that if I did not put ink on that page within the next 10 seconds, he would signal the men outside to come in and drag me away in a straitjacket. I slowly raised my head and looked directly at the document. Then I turned my gaze toward the men sitting across the table. The fake tears were completely gone from my eyes. The trembling in my hands had permanently stopped. I placed the gold fountain pen gently down on top of the legal papers. I released my grip completely and folded my hands neatly on my lap, resting them directly over my heavy leather purse. Greg stared at the pen resting innocently on the table. His thick eyebrows drew together in a tight knot of profound confusion. He did not understand what was happening. He looked down at me, his face darkening with a sudden violent flash of anger. He demanded to know exactly what I was doing. He told me I was making a terrible, catastrophic mistake and that he would wave the paramedics inside right this very second if I did not pick the pen back up. Beatrice stepped out of the shadows, her heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. She crossed her arms over her chest and glared at me with pure, unadulterated venom. She told me to stop playing these pathetic, childish games. She said I was a weak, useless woman and that I was only delaying the inevitable outcome. She ordered me to sign the documents and get out of her beautiful house before she threw me out onto the street herself. I did not flinch. I did not look away from her. I simply stared at her with a calm, empty expression that made her stop walking entirely. The smug victory on her face began to slip just a fraction of an inch. She looked at Greg and then looked nervously back at me. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat loudly and adjusted his expensive silk tie. He leaned forward, resting his manicured hands on the table, and told me that refusing to sign would result in an immediate involuntary psychiatric hold. He said the state would seize my assets to pay for my long-term care, and I would end up with absolutely nothing. Dr. Harrison nodded in solemn agreement. clicking his pen and opening his notepad. He said my refusal was a clear clinical sign of severe oppositional defiance and paranoid delusion. He told me he was officially documenting my lack of cooperation for the medical authorities to ensure I was locked away for the rest of my natural life. They were all playing their parts perfectly, reading from a wicked script they had rehearsed 1,000 times. But they did not know that their play was already over. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the stagnant air of the dining room. I looked up at Greg and told him in a quiet, even tone that I was not going to sign anything. I told him he was never going to touch my home, my retirement accounts, or my husband's life insurance policy. I said his entire master plan was a complete and utter failure. Greg let out a harsh, cruel laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. He shook his head and looked at the corrupt professionals sitting across from me. He told them I was completely detached from reality. He said it was finally time to call the men from the ambulance and have me physically restrained and sedated. He turned toward the large bay window, raising his hand to give the final silent signal to the paramedics parked in my driveway. I did not move. I simply kept my eyes fixed on his broad back and began to speak. I started with a long string of numbers. I recited the digits slowly and clearly, letting each individual number hang in the quiet room like a physical blow. I said 4729184. Greg froze instantly, his hands suspended awkwardly in midair. The harsh red and white lights from the ambulance flashed rapidly across his face, illuminating a sudden stark look of total bewilderment. He slowly lowered his arm and turned around to look at me, his dark eyes wide with confusion. I did not stop speaking. I recited the next string of numbers with absolute perfect precision. I said 8830521. Beatrice let out a sharp, audible gasp. The delicate china teacup in her hand rattled violently against its matching saucer. The sound of the fragile porcelain clinking together was incredibly loud in the dead silence of the room. Mr. Sterling frowned deeply and looked from Beatrice to Greg, clearly confused by their sudden extreme physical reactions. Dr. Harrison stopped writing on his notepad, his pen hovering uselessly over the paper. I kept my voice perfectly even and clinical as I continued to speak. I told Greg that those numbers were not random delusions. I told him those were the primary routing numbers for 2 very specific offshore bank accounts located deep in the Cayman Islands. I told him those secret accounts were registered under a phantom shell company called Horizon Enterprises. I recited the exact date of incorporation for Horizon Enterprises. I named the registered legal agents, listing Gregory Caldwell and Beatrice Caldwell as the sole managing directors of the fraudulent corporation. The color completely drained from Greg's face, leaving him looking like a ghost in the flashing red light. He looked like a man who had just been struck by a massive jolt of electricity. His mouth opened slightly, but absolutely no words came out. He took a stumbling, clumsy step backward, bumping heavily into the dining room wall. Beatrice dropped her teacup. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered instantly into dozens of sharp white pieces, splashing dark hot tea across her expensive leather shoes. She did not even look down at the mess. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Her chest heaved rapidly as she struggled to pull air into her tightening lungs. I did not give them a single second to recover their composure. I kept going, relentlessly driving the nails into their coffins. I recited the exact dates and the exact dollar amounts of the largest wire transfers they had made. I told them about the $300,000 moved on the 12th of August. I told them about the $500,000 siphoned out on the 3rd of November. I explained in great detail how I knew exactly how Beatrice had manipulated the corporate tax software to hide the missing funds and make the logistics company appear to be drowning in massive, inescapable debt. I told them they had systematically stolen over $8 million from my husband over the course of 2 brutal years. Mr. Sterling, the corrupt family attorney, pushed his chair away from the dining table with sudden, violent force. The legs of the heavy wooden chair scraped loudly and unpleasantly against the floor. He looked at Greg with a mixture of rising anger and pure, unadulterated panic. He demanded to know exactly what I was talking about. He asked Greg in a high-pitched, terrified voice if there was a massive federal investigation he had not been informed about before taking this job. Greg could not answer him. Greg was completely paralyzed, staring at me as if I had just transformed into a terrifying monster right before his very eyes. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. Dr. Harrison closed his leather notepad and hastily tucked his silver pen into his breast pocket. He looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically from the flashing ambulance lights outside the window to the shattered pieces of the teacup on the floor. He realized instantly that the situation had completely spiraled out of his control. He realized that the frightened, helpless widow he had been handsomely paid to terrorize was actually holding all the cards. Every patronizing word he had spoken was now evidence of his own medical malpractice and criminal conspiracy. I turned my attention away from Greg and looked directly at Beatrice. The smug, triumphant hatred in her eyes had been entirely replaced by a raw, primal terror. She was trembling visibly from head to toe, her hands shaking so hard she had to grab the edge of the dining table just to stay upright. I kept my voice freezing cold as I delivered the final devastating blow. I told them the financial extortion, the shell companies, and the millions of stolen dollars were bad enough, but the murder was what truly sealed their ultimate fate. I recited the complex chemical name of the lethal, untraceable stimulant they had used to stop my husband's heart. I pronounced every single complicated syllable of the dangerous drug with absolute, perfect clarity, leaving absolutely no room for misunderstanding. I watched their faces contort in absolute horror as the reality of my words washed over them. I told them I knew exactly how Greg had slipped into Richard's home office during our family dinner last Sunday, while everyone else was distracted in the kitchen. I told them I knew he had quietly opened Richard's leather briefcase and swapped his necessary daily heart medication for the deadly toxic pills. I detailed exactly how the stimulant was chemically designed to trigger a massive fatal cardiac arrest that would look absolutely identical to a natural heart attack, confounding the local medical examiners. I told them I knew they had sat at my dining table eating the roast I had cooked and smiling warmly at my husband while they handed him a literal death sentence. The atmosphere in the room completely shattered. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of the truth crashed down upon them, crushing their arrogance and their confidence into fine dust. They were no longer the powerful predators controlling my life and deciding my future. They were cornered, desperate criminals facing the total destruction of their existence. The absolute silence that followed my revelation was thicker and more terrifying than any shouting match could ever be. Dr. Harrison stumbled backward away from the table, nearly tripping over his own feet. His face was slick with a cold, nervous sweat that shone in the flashing emergency lights. He grabbed his expensive leather medical bag from the floor with shaking, frantic hands. He mumbled loudly that he had absolutely nothing to do with any murder or any financial theft. He told Greg in a panicked, breathless voice that he was a doctor, not a killer, and that he was leaving this house immediately. He said he would not be a party to this insane, deadly conspiracy for any amount of money. He turned his back on us and practically ran toward the heavy oak doors that led to the front foyer. He grabbed the shiny brass handles and yanked them hard, expecting to make a quick, clean escape into the fresh morning air. The doors did not move a single inch. He pulled again, throwing his entire body weight into the desperate effort, grunting with exertion. The heavy wood remained completely solid and unyielding. The doors were locked tight from the outside. Dr. Harrison spun around his face, a mask of absolute frantic panic. He looked at me, his chest heaving with sheer terror, and demanded that I give him the keys to the house. He told me to unlock the doors right now, or he would smash a window and climb out himself. He was completely losing his mind, terrified of being trapped in a room with murderers and the evidence of his own corruption. I sat perfectly still in my chair, resting my hands calmly on my leather purse. I looked at the corrupt doctor, the crooked lawyer, the treacherous mother-in-law, and the murderous brother-in-law. I smiled a slow, terrible, knowing smile. I told Dr. Harrison that I did not lock the doors. I told him I did not have the keys because Greg had stolen them from me the night before. I pointed a steady, calm finger toward the large bay window, where the red and white emergency lights were still flashing rhythmically against the glass reflecting off the walls of my beautiful dining room. I told them the people waiting outside in the driveway were not paramedics. I told them the white ambulance parked under the oak tree was nothing but a brilliant tactical decoy. I told them the men standing outside were highly trained federal agents, and they were the ones who had locked the doors from the outside, securing the perimeter. I watched the last remaining shreds of hope drain from their faces as the trap finally snapped completely and irrevocably shut. I continued speaking, my voice cutting through their panic like a sharp blade. I looked at Greg, who was leaning heavily against the wall, trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of his failure. I told him that while he thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess, he was actually just walking blindly into a federal sting operation. I explained that Richard had never trusted him. I told him that Richard had suspected the embezzlement for months and had been quietly gathering the evidence, documenting every single fake invoice and every fraudulent transfer. I told them Richard had found the offshore accounts long before they ever decided to swap his pills. Beatrice let out a low, wailing sound, covering her face with her trembling hands. The sharp shards of her broken teacup crunched beneath her shoes as she swayed on her feet. Mr. Sterling, the lawyer, began furiously shoving his legal documents back into his briefcase, his hands moving with frantic, uncoordinated speed. He muttered over and over that he was just a hired contractor, that he knew nothing about any poison or any shell companies. He claimed he was a victim of Greg deception, desperately trying to distance himself from the sinking ship. But I knew the federal agents outside had heard every single word spoken in this dining room. I knew they had recorded the threats, the blackmail, and the blatant attempts to force my signature on those fraudulent papers. The wiretaps hidden in the house were crystal clear. I looked at Dr. Harrison, who was now leaning against the locked oak doors, breathing in shallow, rapid gasps. I told him his medical license was going to be permanently revoked. I told him he would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison cell, reflecting on the terrible choices that led him to sell his soul to a man like Greg. The flashing red and white lights from the decoy ambulance suddenly turned off, plunging the dining room back into the soft, natural morning sunlight. The abrupt absence of the strobe effect made the room feel incredibly still. A heavy, loud pounding sounded against the solid wood of the front door. The sound echoed through the entire house, signaling the absolute end of their reign of terror. The federal agents were no longer waiting in the shadows. They were here to dismantle the criminal empire piece by piece. I stood up from my chair, picking up my leather purse and clutching it firmly. I looked at the 4 terrified, broken people surrounding me. I told them they should probably get the door. The heavy, loud pounding against the solid wood of the front door echoed through the entire house like a violent thunderclap. The sound was so immense and so unexpected that it actually shook the crystal droplets hanging from the dining room chandelier above our heads. Greg stumbled backward away from the bay window, his face completely drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost rise from the grave. The arrogant, cruel monster who had terrorized me for days was suddenly reduced to a trembling, terrified coward. He looked at the locked oak doors of the foyer with wide, unblinking eyes. He knew deep down in his dark soul that the people on the other side of those doors were not the corrupt paramedics he had hired to take me away. The people on the other side of those doors were the architects of his ultimate destruction. Beatrice let out a high-pitched whimpering sound. She clutched the fabric of her expensive designer dress as if her wicked heart was going to beat right out of her chest. Dr. Harrison, the corrupt psychiatrist, pressed his back flat against the wall, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. His leather medical bag dropped from his shaking hands, hitting the floor with a dull, heavy thud. Mr. Sterling, the crooked family lawyer, simply froze in place, his hands still hovering nervously over his expensive briefcase. The absolute panic radiating from the four of them filled the room with a suffocating, desperate energy. The pounding sounded again this time, accompanied by a deep, booming voice demanding immediate entry. Federal agents opened the door. The loud command ripped through the stagnant air of my dining room, destroying any lingering illusions Greg and Beatrice might have harbored. They were not facing a simple misunderstanding or a neighbor complaining about the noise. They were facing the full, unstoppable force of the federal government. Before Greg could even think about moving toward the foyer to unlock the deadbolt, a massive, deafening crash splintered the morning silence. The heavy reinforced oak doors that Richard and I had picked out together years ago were violently kicked open. The sound of breaking wood and shattering locks echoed through the hallway like an explosion. The heavy doors swung inward, smashing against the walls with incredible force. Instantly, the foyer was completely flooded with men and women in dark tactical gear. The bright yellow letters spelling out FBI across their armored vests stood out in stark contrast to the elegant, refined decor of my home. Local police officers in crisp blue uniforms swarmed into the house right behind them, their heavy black boots thundering across the polished hardwood floors. The sheer volume of law enforcement officers pouring into the residence was a breathtaking display of absolute unyielding power. They moved with flawless military precision, fanning out across the hallway and securing every single exit. Several heavily armed agents rushed directly into the formal dining room, their expressions completely devoid of mercy. They shouted loud, clear commands, ordering everyone to freeze and keep their hands exactly where they could be seen. I remained perfectly still in my antique chair, gripping my leather purse with a profound sense of peaceful satisfaction. I watched the chaos unfold around me, feeling as though I were sitting in the calm, silent eye of a massive hurricane. The storm was destroying everything in its path, but it was leaving me completely untouched. Greg raised his large hand slowly into the air, his entire massive body trembling violently. He tried to speak, to formulate some kind of pathetic excuse or blustering lie to talk his way out of the trap, but his vocal cords completely failed him. All that came out of his mouth was a weak, pathetic stammer. The federal agents did not care about his excuses. 2 armored agents closed in on him immediately, grabbing his raised arms and forcing him to stay right where he was standing. Mr. Sterling tried to take a careful step backward, attempting to physically distance himself from the fraudulent legal documents scattered across my dining table. He raised his manicured hands and began shouting that he was only a hired attorney, that he was completely unaware of any criminal activity, and that he had simply been retained for a routine estate transfer. He was lying through his teeth, and everyone in the room knew it perfectly well. A tall, stern-faced agent stepped directly into his path, pointing a firm finger at the lawyer chest and telling him to remain absolutely silent. Dr. Harrison looked as though he was going to be violently ill. His face was slick with a cold, nervous sweat, and his wire-rimmed glasses were sliding down the bridge of his nose. He pressed himself harder against the floral wallpaper, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an escape route that simply did not exist. Then the sea of dark jackets and blue uniforms parted perfectly down the middle of the hallway. The loud shouts and commands of the federal agents faded into a sudden respectful silence. The heavy thudding of tactical boots was replaced by the steady, measured sound of familiar footsteps walking across the hardwood floor. I felt a warm tear slide down my cheek, but this time it was a tear of pure, overwhelming joy. I looked toward the doorway of the dining room, my heart soaring with an emotion so powerful it threatened to lift me right out of my chair. Richard walked through the doorway and stepped into the dining room. He was not a corpse. He was not a weak, poisoned victim taking his last agonizing breath in a hospital bed. He was standing tall, strong, and perfectly healthy. He wore a crisp, dark suit, and his silver hair was neatly combed. He looked exactly like the brilliant, powerful man I had fallen in love with all those decades ago. But there was a look in his eyes that I had never seen before. It was a look of cold, absolute, terrifying fury. He was staring directly at the mother and the brother who had conspired to brutally murder him for his wealth. The shock that ripped through the dining room was explosive and entirely cinematic. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated devastation for the monsters who had tried to ruin my life. Beatrice let out a sound that I can only describe as the dying gasp of a trapped animal. Her eyes bulged out of her skull as she stared at her supposedly dead son, standing perfectly alive in front of her. Her wicked mind completely rejected the reality of what she was seeing, the medical impossibility of the moment, the absolute realization that her flawless, murderous plan had been a total illusion, completely shattered her fragile sanity. Her knees buckled beneath her. She let out one final weak cry before her eyes rolled back into her head. She collapsed completely, falling hard onto the hardwood floor and landing directly in the spilled tea and shattered porcelain of her broken teacup. She lay there motionless, entirely defeated by the sight of her own living son. Greg stared at Richard, as if staring into the face of a vengeful demon. The realization that he had not killed his brother, that the entire funeral, the grief, and the massive inheritance were nothing but an elaborate trap, hit him with the force of a freight train. The cowardice that lived deep inside his soul entirely took over. With a sudden desperate roar, Greg lunged forward. He shoved a heavy dining chair out of his way, sending it crashing to the floor, and made a wild, frantic dash for the kitchen. He thought he could reach the back door and escape into the sprawling backyard. He thought he could somehow outrun the federal government and the severe consequences of his horrific crimes. He did not even make it 3 steps. 2 federal agents intercepted him with brutal, crushing efficiency. They tackled his massive frame, driving their shoulders directly into his torso. Greg let out a breathless grunt as his feet were swept completely out from under him. The 3 men crashed heavily onto the polished hardwood floor, shaking the entire dining room. The agents pinned Greg face down against the floorboards, driving their knees into his back to completely neutralize his struggling. Greg thrashed wildly for a few seconds like a dying fish on a dock, but the agents were too strong and too well trained. They twisted his arms forcefully behind his back. The sharp metallic clicking sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around Greg's wrists echoed through the room like the sweetest music I had ever heard. Richard did not even blink as his brother was violently subdued and shackled right in front of him. He did not look at his mother lying unconscious on the floor in a puddle of cold tea. He walked slowly past the chaos, past the armed agents, and past the terrified, corrupt professionals. He walked directly over to where I was sitting. The cold fury in his eyes completely melted away the moment he looked down at me. It was instantly replaced by a deep, profound well of endless love and admiration. He reached out with his warm, strong hands and gently lifted me up from my chair. I wrapped my arms tightly around his waist, burying my face against his chest and listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of his beating heart. He wrapped his arms around my shoulders, holding me incredibly close. He leaned down and pressed a long, warm, lingering kiss to my forehead. "It is over, Caroline," he whispered, his voice thick with deep emotion. "You were so incredibly brave, my love. The nightmare is permanently over." I closed my eyes, letting the sheer relief wash through every single cell in my body. We had done it. We had survived the darkest, most terrifying trial of our entire lives. We had played their twisted, wicked game, and we had beaten them with absolute perfection. Richard slowly pulled back, keeping one protective arm wrapped tightly around my waist. He turned his attention back to the room. He looked down at Greg, who was currently being hauled roughly to his feet by the federal agents, his face red and contorted in a mixture of physical pain and profound humiliation. Richard looked at Dr. Harrison, who was trembling against the wall, and Mr. Sterling, who was sweating profusely next to his open briefcase. Richard's voice cut through the room, carrying the heavy absolute weight of total authority. He spoke directly to the people who had tried to steal our lives. "You truly thought you were the smartest people in the room," Richard began, his tone freezing cold. "You truly believed you could poison me, declare my innocent wife insane, and steal the empire I spent my entire life building. You thought you were executing the perfect, untraceable crime." Greg glared at Richard, panting heavily, his chest heaving against the tight grip of the federal agents holding his arms. How he hissed through his teeth, his voice dripping with venom and utter disbelief. "How are you alive? I swapped the pills. I saw you take them. I watched you die." Richard offered his brother a smile utterly devoid of any warmth or mercy. "You watched me take a harmless placebo, Greg. You watched me fake a cardiac arrest perfectly coordinated with my personal physician and the federal authorities. You see, I have known about your pathetic attempts to embezzle money from the logistics company for over a year. I watched you and Mother slowly siphon millions of dollars into your offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. I allowed you to think you were getting away with it so I could build an airtight federal case against you both. But when the FBI informed me that you were searching for lethal, untraceable stimulants on the black market, we knew we had to force your hand. We had to let you attempt the murder so we could catch you committing the ultimate crime." The color completely washed out of Greg's face once again. The crushing reality of the elaborate sting operation finally penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. He realized that every single step he had taken over the last 2 years had been closely monitored, heavily documented, and perfectly anticipated. "And while you were busy trying to force my grieving widow to sign away her life," Richard continued, pointing a finger toward the dining room chandelier right above the table, "you had absolutely no idea that this entire house was completely wired for sound. The FBI placed covert recording devices in the dining room, the hallway, the study, and the master bedroom, while I was supposedly lying in the city morgue." Dr. Harrison let out a soft, pathetic groan and slid slowly down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head buried in his trembling hands. Mr. Sterling closed his eyes, completely defeated, realizing that his entire prestigious legal career was permanently destroyed. "They heard every single word you spoke in this room," Richard said, his voice echoing with righteous vengeance. "They heard you confess to the embezzlement. They heard you admit to the poisoning. They listened to you gaslight my wife, threaten her with involuntary psychiatric commitment, and attempt to extort her signature using fraudulent medical documents and fake legal contracts. Every threat, every lie, and every ounce of your sickening greed has been perfectly captured on federal wiretaps." A senior FBI agent stepped forward, addressing the corrupt professionals who had sold their souls for a share of the stolen wealth. Dr. Harrison and Mr. Sterling, the agent, said, his voice completely devoid of sympathy, "You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, and accessory to attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it." 2 local police officers moved forward, pulling Mr. Sterling's arms behind his back and snapping cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. The lawyer did not even try to resist. He simply hung his head in absolute shame as the officers read him his Miranda rights. 2 other agents pulled Dr. Harrison up from the floor, violently wrenching his arms backward and locking him in handcuffs. The prestigious doctor wept openly, completely shattered by the realization that he would spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. Meanwhile, a pair of paramedics, the real medical professionals who had followed the police into the house, rushed into the dining room to attend to Beatrice. They checked her vital signs and quickly loaded her limp, unconscious body onto a collapsible gurney. They strapped her down securely, ensuring she could not move. As they wheeled her past the dining table, her head lolled to the side. She looked incredibly old, frail, and entirely pathetic. The woman who had spent 30 years hating me, who had tried to erase my existence, was now being rolled out of my house, strapped to a medical bed, completely broken and facing decades behind bars. Greg struggled against the agents holding him, his face a twisted mask of desperate fury. "You set me up," he screamed, spitting the words at Richard. "You trapped your own flesh and blood. You are a monster." Richard did not flinch. He looked at his brother with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "I did not set you up, Greg. You built your own prison cage with your own greed. I just stood back and let you lock yourself inside it." The federal agents jerked Greg forward, marching him roughly toward the foyer. They dragged him through the hallway, his heavy shoes scuffing against the hardwood floor. He cursed and shouted, struggling the entire way, but his resistance was entirely useless. He was forcefully paraded out of the front door and pushed down the porch steps. I stood next to Richard, watching the magnificent cinematic satisfaction of the moment unfold. We watched through the large bay window as Greg, Dr. Harrison, and Mr. Sterling were marched down the driveway. They were paraded right past the white decoy ambulance that Greg had intended to use as my personal prison transport. The absolute irony was a beautiful, perfect justice. The neighborhood was awake now, drawn by the commotion and the flashing emergency lights. The neighbors stood on their lawns and sidewalks watching in stunned silence as the wealthy, arrogant Gregory Caldwell was forcefully shoved into the back of a marked police cruiser. The officers slammed the heavy door shut, trapping the criminals inside the cramped, caged back seats. The sirens wailed to life, a loud, piercing sound that signaled the ultimate victory of truth over deception. The convoy of police vehicles and black federal transport units slowly pulled out of my driveway, carrying the monsters far away from my home forever. The house slowly grew quiet as the remaining agents finished collecting the fraudulent documents from the dining table and securing the perimeter. The heavy, suffocating dark cloud that had hovered over this property for days was completely gone, replaced by the warm, bright glow of the morning sun shining through the windows. Richard turned to me, pulling me into another deep, comforting embrace. He held me tightly, burying his face in my hair. "We did it, Caroline," he whispered, his voice full of profound relief and endless love. "We survived. They will never be able to hurt us ever again." I rested my head against his chest, listening to his strong, steady heartbeat. The nightmare was truly over. We had risen from the ashes of their deceit, and we had reclaimed our beautiful life. I looked around my quiet, peaceful dining room, feeling an immense, overwhelming sense of absolute freedom. We were finally safe. 6 months later, I sat beside my wonderful husband in a crowded federal courtroom, holding his warm hand as the judge read the final devastating verdicts. Greg and Beatrice stood at the defense table wearing matching orange prison jumpsuits. Their wrists were shackled in heavy iron chains. They looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, wealthy predators who had terrorized me in my own dining room. The judge looked down at them with pure disgust and did not hold back a single ounce of justice. He sentenced them both to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Their convictions included conspiracy to commit murder wire fraud and severe elder financial abuse. When the heavy sentence was read aloud, Beatrice let out a loud, agonizing wail that echoed off the high courtroom walls, but Greg just stared blankly at the floor, completely shattered. They had risked their entire lives and their own souls out of pure greed, and in the end they lost the only thing that truly mattered. Their freedom was permanently gone. The corrupt professionals who had so eagerly assisted in their twisted plot faced their own swift reckoning. Dr. Harrison, the man who tried to lock me in an asylum, had his medical license permanently revoked. He was sentenced to 10 years behind bars for his part in fabricating my psychiatric evaluation. Mr. Sterling, the crooked family attorney, was stripped of his legal credentials, disbarred in disgrace, and sent to a federal penitentiary for extortion and conspiracy. Watching those smug, powerful men get led away in handcuffs felt like a massive, suffocating weight lifting right off my chest. Justice had finally been served, and the nightmare was officially over. Richard and I knew we could never live in that house again. The beautiful mahogany dining room held too many dark memories of betrayal and suffocating fear. So we packed up the things we truly loved and sold the property completely untouched by the malice of his toxic relatives. With the money, we bought a beautiful little house in a quiet coastal beach town far away from the shadows of the past. Now our mornings are not filled with fear or manipulation. Instead, we wake up to the gentle sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore. We drink our coffee on the wooden porch in absolute peace, watching the beautiful sunrise together. We survived the darkest storm imaginable and built a brand new life entirely on our own terms. I learned that sometimes the people who share your blood are the most dangerous enemies you will ever face. But if you stand your ground and fight with the truth, you will always win. If you enjoyed my story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for listening, and until next time.